Welcome everyone to another wonderful collaboration between the Professional Development College and the Sustainable Environment Institute. My name is Lourdes Brent. I'm a counselor, an EOPS counselor at Los Angeles Trade Technical College, but also currently serving as the secretary for the District Academic Senate and the coordinator for the DAS's Professional Development College. If you all registered through the Vision Resource Center, you will be receiving flex credit for this event. I want to thank George Letty, Beth Abels, and Zhao Behlendorf for putting together an excellent program. I will be sitting back in the weeds and enjoying it with everyone. I believe that George will be our moderator. So take it away, George.
Thank you, Lourdes. Well, yes, welcome everyone to this, our Sustainable Environment Institute Earth Day on the 28th of April. We have a very good program for you today, and I would, of course, refer you to what's behind me on my over here is our website, which actually has a whole page dedicated to today, and that features some articles and materials that will help you navigate the very complicated issues that we have to share with you today. Beneath that is, you can see the times that we have set aside. So as you might have seen from our flyers, we've named this day Film, Fashion, and Food. And very appropriately, we will be starting with the fashion industry. Our film series has actually been up and running since April 14th, and the appropriate flyer can lead you to how you can stream those films directly from Canopy and from YouTube and other sources. But they are a good curated list of short films, even longer feature films on these very same issues. So we'll probably have among our guests today some reference to those. So our first guest today is Ken Pucker, who is an operator, advisor, investor, educator with an abiding focus on sustainability and the United Nations goals of environment, sustainability, governance. He's a professor of practice at the Tufts Fletcher School, and he serves at Berkshire Partners and an advisory director, where he's a founding member of the firm's Responsible Investment Committee. So Ken Pucker really stands in that interesting intersection between environmental advocacy and research and knowledge of a very dominant economic sector that most of us don't even think about, and that is the apparel and fashion industry. So we're very fortunate to have Ken Pucker with us today, because his scholarship, as you can see from the Harvard Business Review article that is linked on our webpage, actually is a good discussion on the myths of sustainability regarding an industry that makes lots of claims. And Ken Pucker is close to this industry. He's worked with Timberland, and rather than fill in for him, welcome Ken Pucker to the SEI's Sustainable Environment Institute's event today on April 28th.
Thank you for having me.
And when we looked at this complicated issue of fashion, we felt it was a little bit out of our bailiwick. Normally in the SEI series seminars, we deal with climate and water and heat, and we're branching out. And thanks to work from people like you, and I have to say there aren't a lot of people that have been looking at this industry with the fine-tooth comb that you've given it. We did post on the website, for example, there might be a Brookings Institution report on the industry. There's industry reports on the industry, but it's rare to find somebody who is standing at a distance from it and can actually make those assessments. When you point out that sustainability is a myth in the apparel industry, is it an entire production change from raw materials to disposal?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at fashion, it does have a profound and outsized impact on the environment. And it's grown considerably over time. So as of today, based on the data we have, which is scant, the apparel industry, fashion industry, consumes over 70 million barrels of oil annually. So about 1% of all global oil output. Leaves behind 92 million tons of waste annually, and consumes over 90 billion cubic meters of water, and also is responsible for somewhere between 2 and 10% of global emissions. if you look back to about the year 2000, when the ramp up started of claims of sustainable practice, organic, green, eco from the fashion industry, it's over that same exact period that production is also ramped up dramatically. We now produce somewhere between 100 and 150 billion items of fashion annually, which is more than twice it was just 15 years ago. And so sustainability and fashion don't actually sit compatibly in the same realm today. And fashion does have an outsized environmental impact, as I've described.
Well, that is something that, we're 150 billion items a year.
You can even think of just one player. H&M, for example, produces close to 600 million items per year, and their plan is to get to over 1 billion alone, one company, by the year 2030. Over the period of time we're describing, kind of the last 20-year period, fashion has gone from an industry that was pretty much seasonal. There was fall and spring, typically 2 seasons. Then we added a 3rd season called holiday. And now we've become almost seasonless. There are brands like Shein, which introduce literally thousands of new styles each week today, making what were formerly fast fashion sellers like Zara and H&M look slow by contrast. And so the whole cycle of newness and planned obsolescence and conditioning people to buy new items only is speeding up and up. And so we have more challenge. At the same time, we have more claims of sustainable practice.
Well, that sort of dovetails with the question I had. Being a California resident, as you might know, we have some fashion brands that are kind of not only big in California, but they also have a lot of influence on the environmental movement or on what people perceive as sustainable practices. I'm thinking of, for example, Patagonia. And I recently got email from Patagonia that had nothing to do with clothing. It was a whole campaign for wilderness protection in, I think, Argentina. So these claims, some of them might in fact be based on facts and activities and programs that these companies have, and other ones might be strict greenwashing. How do you assess whether claims made by the companies that have this sort of shine, like Patagonia or Timberland, how do we get inside their practices and, in a sense, assess whether, as consumers, we would make that consumer choice of supporting companies that have a supply chain that is not exploitative, that have a sourcing that is environmentally sustainable, and that they find a way to recycle their finished products? Does that exist at all?
Unfortunately, it doesn't. And I think your question is a prescient one. In the US, the regulatory framework to assess sustainable claims is very weak. For the first time, I think in 11 years, the green claims codes are being updated. Europe is much more forceful in terms of intervention on claims, but that's a newer development. Outside the EU, though, Asia, around the world, there's very little regulatory guidance, and so claims go unchecked. But that's just one part of the problem. Another part of the problem is the complexity associated with claims. So if I were to ask you, George, is it better for the environment were you to buy an organic cotton t-shirt, a cotton t-shirt, or a nylon t-shirt? You'd probably answer organic cotton. And the answer, in fact, correct answer would be it depends. And the reason is it depends on what measure you're seeking to become better against. So, for example, cotton is a very water consumptive crop, and nylon typically lasts longer than cotton. Nylon, though, is made from an extractive item. It's fossil fuels spun and extruded. Most consumers don't understand that the Lululemon top or Nike top or Lululemon Athleta tights they're buying are literally oil. Polyester is oil that's been treated and then extruded into thread and sewn into garments. And so if you as a consumer want to do the right thing, and I answer you when you ask the question, is this more or less sustainable than that, with it depends, I'm asking you to go look at a life cycle analysis and inspect a supply chain which is global across multiple tiers. It's really hard to expect consumers, even who want to do the right thing, to have access to the information and or have the time to research how to do the right thing. One last point, which is Patagonia, which is, I think, a paragon of actually trying to do the right thing, both in terms of practice and in terms of advocacy and activism. I think there's probably no better company in the space, literally globally. That company, when it reached 200 million in sales, the company is 100% owned by Yvon Chouinard and his wife. He said publicly, no one needs another fleece. We're going to stop growing at 200 million. And yet today, Patagonia sales are in excess of $1 billion. And the vast majority of their products are made from polyester, which again is fossil fuel. And so it just shows you how pernicious the problems are, that those that are most committed to positive environmental outcomes are challenged when it comes to the impact of their production on the planet.
Very revealing, because yes, sometimes we are subject to the public relations successes of a lot of firms that convince us that buying their product is somehow the greener thing to do. But you're shedding light on that in a very valuable way. If Patagonia, in fact, is the paragon, and even they can't run away. I miss my Patagonia fleece jacket. There's something that comes up often when I talk to my friends who are in oceanography or climate, and particularly they're concerned about plastics and plastics in the ocean. And one of the things they point out is microfibers, that from what I read, microfibers are increasing in terms of how much modern society basically puts into the environment, all oceans, atmosphere, soils, etc., and that they're everywhere. Is cotton, for instance, it's a cotton microfiber, relatively benign compared to a nylon microfiber, or is it just, it's microfiber?
You know, I'm not an oceanographer, nor do I have a science background to answer the question. I can tell you the industry wants you to believe that cotton is more benign, but based on the data I've seen thus far, fashion overall is responsible for close to 30% of all microfiber that is in the ocean. And the synthetic microfiber that is from fleece is particularly damaging. And so the industry is now, Patagonia is actually working with, I think it's Electrolux, they're, washing machine manufacturers to come up with a catch such that when microfibers are washed, they don't actually leave the environment of the washing machine, but end up getting caught in a bin such that they can be disposed of safely. And the industry is going to have to deal with this because it's becoming a more pervasive challenge.
Oh, absolutely. When I unfortunately, I do shop at Costco. One of the things that amazes me about Costco is the mountains of clothing that occupy a good chunk of the footprint of the whole store. It's like the middle of the store, and it's mountains and mountains, and it's $12, $8.50. And of course, I did once upon a time buy my clothing there, and my sister-in-law told me, "Oh my God, how could you?" But it just looked really bad. But there it is. I see all these people that are low income or working class people buying their clothes at Costco. Is that what it brings to mind for me is the stories I read about fires in sweatshops in Bangladesh, or the conditions of production, that how those cheap clothing items are made is sweatshop labor in a lot of the global South. Is there any, considering that these fires have killed hundreds of workers in different countries of the global South, but particularly I think in Bangladesh, what measures are being taken internationally to bring some sense of practice or responsibility along the supply chain to address the sweatshop problem?
So we actually are marking the 10-year anniversary of the building collapse you're thinking about in Bangladesh that took the lives of over 1,000 people, mostly women. And I think their Bangladesh Accord was signed as a result, and there have been some improvements in supply chains in Bangladesh. But broadly, the challenges you're referencing of sweatshops and global supply chain remain. The fashion industry is an itinerant industry. It goes from country to country based on wage rates. It's still a very unmechanized, high-touch industry. When I started working at Timberland in 1992, we made 100% of our own production in 4 factories, 3 of which were US-based. Today, that would be a real outlier. Production has moved over that period of time alone from Korea and Taiwan to China, and now increasingly to Vietnam and India, and even some to Africa, all in service of cheaper wages. When you think about relative, I know inflation's a big topic these days. If you think about relative inflation of different categories over a 20-year period, you see healthcare and education going up like this. In fact, when you look at apparel, it's been deflationary over a 20-year period. And that is in large part because of search for cheap wages and compromised work conditions, unfortunately. It's also been abetted by a shift from natural fibers to synthetics. If you go back 25 years ago, more than 50% of production in apparel was from natural fibers, wool or cotton. Today, more than 70% of production is from synthetics. And so that's why you're able to buy a top from Shein for $8 or find a pair of jeans at Costco for $12.
Well, it is the entire process is also made worse in a way by the rather reckless disposal. I ran into this article that I've also posted on the website, and I'll just maybe ask Beth to put the link to the actual page that we have that's for April 28th. And one of the links in there is about an enormous pile of disposed clothing in the Atacama Desert of Chile. And those of us who've studied South America and arid lands, you can see my bailiwick is natural resources and agriculture. But the Atacama Desert is one of the driest places on Earth, which means that material that's there is not exactly going to decompose in the next rain. And it is quite impressive to see the size of this piles and piles of. I'm wondering, how did Chile end up being so lucky to be the recipient of the world's I guess disposed of clothing, with the other one being that a lot of clothing people give away, maybe to Goodwill, thinking that it's going to help somebody who has no money, ends up being sold in markets in Africa as not as new, but it does get a second sale that the donor didn't think was going to happen. So it's yet another level of squeezing money out of this industry. Is there does that enter the radar at all when people discuss environment and apparel, the Atacama Desert or the clothing markets in Abidjan?
So the desert in Chile and the Kenya and Ghana are 2 of the largest disposal sites for Western apparel. Think about the following statistics, which are haunting. Over the last 10 years, the average wear time for a garment has decreased by 40%, which means people are buying lots more and throwing it away more and more quickly. It's become more disposable, especially as it's become increasingly synthetics and cheaper. In the US, an item will, 85% of items will end up either in landfill, incinerated, or shipped off somewhere far, far away, out of sight, out of mind, causing enormous consequential environmental damage that we don't see here in our day-to-day. And so as long as apparel gets cheaper and cheaper, and as long as apparel purveyors or fashion purveyors are pushing a cycle that is now faster, then kind of a way has gone away. The disposal needs to go somewhere. The average American buys over 50 items of new fashion a year today. 52 is the number I most recently saw. And so until we actually begin to find sanity and lessen that cycle of purchasing and disposal, we will continue to have the challenge we have. One other thing I thought I would just address that I see in the chat, there's some really good posts about Patagonia. And Patagonia uses a great deal of recycled polyester, which is accurate. But one thing which many folks don't understand is that recycled polyester comes almost exclusively from plastic bottles, your Sprite bottle or your Coke bottle, etc. And it's much better were that recycled polyester to be used in a bottle again, as opposed to a garment, because garments are typically worn once and thrown away. Whereas if it were used in a bottle, it can be upcycled almost, in over and over, multiple times. And now there's competition for this recycled plastic bottles between the bottle industry and fashion, because there's an insufficient amount for both. And so by fashion taking those goods, it actually is a net negative environmentally. One final point. Again, I think Patagonia is as good as it gets, and I think they're a paragon. There's mention in the chat of their resale program, which is a breakthrough. It's called Wornwear. And Wornwear is just, you can return your Patagonia fleece to the store, they'll buy it back from you, and it gets a second life, being purchased by another consumer, part of this concept of circularity in apparel. And it's really an attractive idea, because from a production standpoint, brands think, well, this would be cool if we could separate natural resource consumption from growth. We can have it all, right? We can grow, which is the markets want us to do, but we can use less resource because we're running out of things. Patagonia recently published themselves, to their credit, a blog post about their Wornwear business. And it, at present, 10 years after its founding, represents less than 1% of their sales. And so I don't mean to say it's not a good thing. It's a great thing, but it's not a salvation.
Well, it is a challenge. I'm sure you might know that our district actually has 9 campuses, and Lourdes Brent, who introduced us at the beginning, is actually at LA Trade Tech College, which is I think it's the only one of our 9 campuses that actually has a fashion program. We did invite the Trade Tech fashion folks, faculty, students to attend. I don't know if they're actually in the audience, because we did send out flyers. But I realize it's a challenge for them. Their program is adjacent to a part of Los Angeles that is actually known as the Fashion Mart. And I think it's still there, despite the economic hiccups that have taken place. But I'm wondering, what latitude do people that are entering this industry as designers, as maybe into fabrication, and there they are at LA Trade Tech taking courses in fashion and fashion design. Can some of these problems be addressed at the very beginning of the process, so that people that are entering the industry might arrive, in a sense, equipped with a whole different set of standards and objectives than what they meet when they get hired at a company? Or is that just wishful thinking?
No, I think it's an important part of the solution. Design has an enormous influence on the environmental footprint of products. In footwear and apparel, it's said to be between 70 and 80% of a product's environmental footprint is determined at its design phase. And to the extent we can teach designers, developers, engineers, techniques that enable more durability in product, longer life of product, less damaging raw material selection in product, that's all helpful. To the extent we can invent bio-based materials to replace synthetic materials, that could be part of the solution as well. I do believe, however, though, that degrowth also needs to be part of the solution. It doesn't mean that everything has to shrink. It does mean, though, that if we are going to create space for the developed world to have refrigerators and cars and a lifestyle that's somewhat analogous to ours, we need to, I think, pull back in the developed world on some categories of consumption which have gotten reasonably out of control, one of which is fashion.
And you mentioned in some of the aspects of the industry that you mentioned, for example, footwear and apparel. And then when I'm thinking of the apparel industry, I'm thinking of the mountains of clothing at Costco, but I don't think sometimes that my need to replace socks and underwear and t-shirts is on the same category as buying collared shirts and pants. But obviously that's in my head. but I'm particularly interested in footwear because that also doesn't get a lot of attention. There are issues there involving, of course, the raising of animals for leather and the dyes that are used. I think also in Bangladesh to dye leather are toxic and they end up polluting the streams, the water sources for a lot of the rural population in Bangladesh. And that today, when I look at, my nice, what do I have there? I got some, some sandals that are Doc Marten sandals, and I flipped them over and made in Vietnam. Suddenly, Vietnam has become this major producer of footwear. Earlier, you mentioned that it's kind of a footloose industry. You call it an itinerant industry. Very, very valuable word there. In other words, would they easily just pick up and leave Vietnam and move to Malaysia for new labor, or is Vietnam now the big shoe maker of the world?
Well, you raise a lot of interesting questions. First, on the Vietnam has a population, I think, of somewhere between 60 and 80 million people. And so it is a workshop for the world in terms of footwear and apparel. But it's limited in terms of size as compared to somewhere like China. And so China is still much, much larger than Vietnam, notwithstanding some of the transition. Wage rates are cheaper in Vietnam today than they are in China, and they're cheaper in India, hence the shift from China to those places. You talked about leather and chemicals. When I started in the footwear industry in the early 90s, there were still tanneries in the United States. But because of tightening environmental laws and restrictions on use of chemicals, almost all those tanneries have left the US now. That doesn't mean the problems of environmental effluent runoff have been solved. It's just that they're no longer US based today. I think there's a few tanneries left in the US. One of them is called Horween, which is an excellent tannery in Chicago that makes the leather for NFL footballs, among other things. They were a big supplier to Timberland when I worked there. But effluent runoff from tanneries and from dye houses is a consequential problem in the developing world connected to fashion.
Well, I have to confess, my niece, Lisa Angelica Furquignani, she's French. She studied fashion. She's still studying fashion. And she actually, before Brexit, she was working in London in the fashion industry. She was very excited about it. And what I realized, of course, is how the vicissitudes of that sector are. I mean, Brexit was just one example where suddenly all the London's always been this great center of design. But what I've noticed in terms of the journalism that covers the fashion industry, it's mostly gush, ray, rah, rah. I rarely run into an article that, for example, if it's in the calendar section of the paper, if it's in the culture section, it'll show, what the new trends are or what, Bjork was wearing at her last concert. There isn't a critical take of the industry either in terms of its supply chains and production standards. But what can we do to get people who write about the industry and about trends in important sources like the New York Times to take a slightly more separate view and to not just jump up and down about the latest trend? Or is it just foregone? They're just going to do it?
No, I think there's some good journalists who are increasingly covering these challenges. There's a woman who writes for the New York Times. I think her name is Vanessa Friedman. She does typically write about style, but last year she wrote a piece about a piece of legislation that I've been working on for the last 2 years called the New York Fashion Act, which is about how we can regulate the fashion industry such that we lift the floor and all actors act as decently as Patagonia, as opposed to having Patagonia or Eileen Fisher or Timberland or Stella McCartney being the outliers that get a lot of deserved press for their efforts, but they represent a very small percentage of the industry. And so I think in order to get the industry to a better standard, we need policy. And give credit to Vanessa Friedman for writing that piece. There's also an excellent journalist in Vogue who writes regularly about sustainable fashion. There's a publication called The Business of Fashion, which covers sustainability issues in a, I think, very comprehensive way. And so I think there are some examples of journalists who are, trying to get the truth out there.
Well, yeah, it is important because I see a lot of, there's a story in, I think yesterday's New York Times. It's right here in Los Angeles, we have a famous boulevard, Fairfax Avenue, which used to be known for a lot of kosher shops and delis. And little by little, the youth fashion industry has sort of found a foothold off of Melrose and onto Fairfax. And you can sometimes see the lines of young people in their hoodies waiting for the store to open because they do these sort of limited runs. They call them drops, where there's like 100 items available. And so I don't know if that just really marks up the price. But what I see with youth culture is that, of course, fashion has always been a very important part of urban youth culture. And a lot of these smaller stores, I mean, what happened now is that the store grew so big that they moved into the old Tower Record store on Sunset Boulevard. You'd have to be familiar with LA to know, really. They have a skate park inside the store. So it appeals a lot to the skateboard culture. So this way of creating a culture around a consumption of a certain set of items, hoodie jackets and baggy pants and so on, in a sense, feeds the obsolescence, right? Because if it's last year, that's so last year, you want the new one. And at the same time, we have Gen Z is probably one of the more environmentally aware generations we've seen, and in many ways, and more climate aware, more concerned about the lack of action policy on climate. How can we reconcile these two things? That youth culture is so deep into ephemeral fashion trends at the same time that they also seem to have very deep commitment to the environment. I know it's a weird question.
No, it's an excellent question, and the paradox is legitimate. I mean, if you look at survey data, Gen Z is more concerned about the environment, and also they profess a desire to shop sustainably at a higher propensity than other cohorts. And so you're right about that. And yet at the same time, that same group is one powering Shein's results, or Zara or Inditex, et cetera. And so that is paradoxical. I don't think it's the fault of Gen Z, however, that we have the challenge as we do, where they say that they want the brands to be more sustainable. It's on a list of wants. So they also want to look fashionable. They don't have a big income, so they want to spend, not a lot. They care about brand, they care about fit, they care about color, they care about style, and yes, sustainability. But remember what we talked about earlier about how hard it is to diligence the truth about sustainable claims, and then also weigh the gap between intention and action when you have all these other purchase drivers, and you end up with an unfulfilled desire to be sustainable, really. The industry is kind of propagating this dopamine-induced planned obsolescence newness cycle, and there's lack of regulation on claims and lack of information, and so you get, let's buy another pair of jeans.
Well, what I find fascinating about your insight into all of this is that you also seem to know a whole lot about the business sector as business, consumer driven, all of the factors that contribute to successful marketing, at the same time that you have a very detailed knowledge of environmental impacts. That is not very typical of people in my bailiwick. We typically are either STEM oriented and we worry about ocean acidification, or we're studying fossil fuel companies. And what advice would you give someone who wants to essentially come up with the insights that you've been developing over your intellectual career? Should a person get a degree in business, or even for that matter in fashion, in order to get into this entire field? Or is there a wider range of so-called specializations that would let a person become effective in addressing fashion and environment?
I think there are lots of ways into being part of the solution. Getting a degree in textile design and fashion and learning about how to minimize impact from production, I think, is one path. I think being an executive in the space and learning on your own kind of environmental impacts is a path. Becoming an environmental scientist and transferring over to work in industry is a path. I think we need more pollination across these types of expertise. in order to get to systemic solutions, which is what we really need.
Well, of course, we're an education institution or higher learning, so that I had to ask that question. A lot of our students are often asking themselves, what do I do with an associate degree? Which associate degree should I pick? And we have both workforce development in our system as well as academic transfer courses. So my curiosity was sort of a bit based on where I'm sitting, that we want to be able to guide students and advise them when they make their study choices and their transfer choices, that they can, in fact, have a job or an education that is firmly environmental at the same time that it follows a lot of their interests. We have, some time left here for Q&A, and I would like to, Beth and Joao Bellendorf, who are my co-curriculum folks at the SEI, are actually monitoring the chat. And if there's any questions people have of Ken Pucker, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, and Beth and Joao will field them. And I did want to note that the link that we had in the chat was for our entire website. And when you're there at the homepage, you'll notice that, of course, we're promoting today with the flyers, and that there's also something called teaching resources. And that tab then takes you to the April 28th page, which has a lot of these articles that we've been actually referring to, including there's a 30-minute interview with Ken Pucker that is on Spotify. And I made many attempts. I hope I succeeded in making that link work and I think it might take you to Spotify. It's an MP3 or it's online. And then there's your article in Harvard Business Review, which is really quite extensive and detailed. So I encourage people to listen to Ken Pucker's 30-minute discussion, as well as to check those articles, but particularly the one in Harvard Business Review. And there's also there's a little survey that Joao was mentioning that we have on the way in for people who want to follow the film series. So in connection with the film series, let me see if I can bring up in my maybe titles for no, oh dear. Rats, I don't have it open. It's on the, yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you because we have a question, and then I'm
Please.
happy to look up the flyer for
the fashion film. Thanks.
So Eugene Lewis asks, what are the best climate solutions we have available at this time for the fashion industry, or at this time? And what would you recommend for consumers about purchasing?
I'll take the second one first. For consumers, I'd recommend a straightforward strategy, which is buy less. I mentioned the average American buys 52 items a year. To get to a place where existing within planetary boundaries, that number has to come down to about 5. So buy better stuff and buy less of it. I would also advocate, buying secondhand. And in terms of industry, I think the industry needs policy. So I would advocate that folks take a look at the website we've created for the New York Fashion Act, which includes a number of different regulatory interventions, including that big companies with revenues over $100 million be forced to comply with a regime called the Science-Based Targets regime, which is a consortium of 5 NGOs which approves corporate plans for carbon remediation and calls for companies to reduce their footprint by somewhere between 4% and 5% a year, independent of growth. And so those are the areas I'd point people to.
We have
So the information on the Fashion Act, Joao just put that up in the chat, and you'll see there's some comments like buy from thrift stores, and I will find for you the film list. Also, Joao just put in a New York State government legislation bills link. So for those of you who are interested in following through on that. So I actually have a question while we're sitting here, and I hear this idea about buying less, and then what are your suggestions about I mean, we know how much waste we're producing, we know how much clothes we're moving through. What do we do? What do we do? How do we support clothing not just getting trashed and turned into landfill or sent to other places that, I mean, what are the strategies for us to be able to, besides buy less, what do we do with what we have? I mean, is it recyclable? Is it waste? How do we think about that?
Well, donating it or selling it to a thrift store is not a bad idea. There's also broader systemic solutions. California is one of the states that's looking into and has actually adopted a number of EPR laws, which stands for Extended Producer Responsibility, which creates levies, fines, or levies penalties on producers to be responsible for the end of life of products like carpeting and paints and fashion in some cases. And so advocacy for EPR legislation is a great way to force the industry to be more precise about disposal.
Okay, thank you. And also I'm seeing some chat here about talk to your families about overbuying. All right. So I think one of the organizations, the Story of Stuff, talks about how much waste, if you guys are looking for sort of some visual information about what that looks like and how much gets produced. And Story of Stuff is a great resource for that. So another question, can you clarify what happens to clothing that's sent abroad? Where can you find out more about working conditions of factories abroad?
Let me just go back one and then I'll go forward. The go back one about talking to relatives about overbuying. There's also a great 20-minute film on Patagonia's site that they've created. I think it's called something like The Monster in Your Closet. And a colleague of mine, Maxine Badat, is featured, and the New York Fashion Act is featured, and it talks about polyester. And it's great education for people who don't understand, like most don't, what the source of polyester is and how it's extruded and what the impact is in terms of lifetime in landfill. Second question was about, I think, how do we find out about working practice in factories? Was that the question? Yeah, I see here, that's what it was. Okay, and that's very difficult. I mean, some big companies, Nike is an example, Reformation's an example, provide annual impact or responsibility reports, which detail their result of their audits of their factories and their compliance with audits and their remediation of challenges. But that requires you to read through a 100-page report, literally. And so it's very difficult. The law that we're proposing in the state of New York would mandate more public disclosure of factories across the entire 5 tiers of the supply chain, including their addresses, whether they pay a living wage, water usage, a whole bunch more information. But as of today, it's not easy.
Well, that does seem to be the challenge for the entire concept that we can somehow reform our patterns of consumption and bring about a sustainable environment where, I think what I tell my students is, well, we can't consume our way out of the crisis we're in. The crisis is in of itself inextricably tied to our levels of ever increasing levels of consumption. And let's see, there's also a question about anyone suggested resources from Diane Cunningham. Beth, does that find a way to incorporate some of this information?
Yeah, so last question, and then we have to move on to our next speaker. But Diane is asking if there are resources where she can find information to incorporate information on external costs for her economics classes. And if you have other suggestions about where all this data might be, all this information, be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, Greenpeace just put out a report today, literally, about, Rana Plaza 10 years hence and some of the externalities of fashion. But there's a lot written, if one were to Google, externalities in fashion. There's an annual report that the Business of Fashion and McKinsey put out on it. BCG puts out an annual report. So there's a lot of good information.
Thank you, Ken Pucker. This has been a great way to start our April 25th April 28th, Earth Day. And for us, a new area of investigation, discussion that I think has been very illuminating. Thanks to all of the work that you do and all of the facts in your head that you've been able to share with us. I want to once again direct people to the page for April 28th that has some infographics that that Ken referred to earlier in terms of the amounts and percentages and tons and the like. So thank you again, Ken Pucker, for starting off our Earth Day events today with the Sustainable Environment Institute. And we will stay tuned to future publications from you, and hopefully our faculty will incorporate your work into their syllabus.
Well, I appreciate your having me. I think the work of community colleges is vital work. I will just, for those that are interested, let you know I've written a piece that's called A Circle That's Hard to Square about circularity in fashion that's coming out in Stanford Social Innovation Review at the end of May. So if you wanted to provide that to folks that are interested, that will be published shortly, but obviously no obligation. And thank you for including me. I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please, we did post and we'll post again evaluation. If you want to fill it out, if you're leaving now, make sure you fill that evaluation out. And if you're staying for the whole event, go ahead and fill it out soon.
Thank you, Beth. Well, as you can see from what's behind me, 9:45 to 10:25, we're going to discuss soils restoration. And it's really my pleasure to introduce two people today, Frank Fitzpatrick and Marcy Evans. Marcy Evans is Executive Director of the Hoofed Foundation, which is the holistic education for reversing desertification. So once again, here we're going to hear something that we've never featured before in our seminars, even though from here on out, we're going to discuss food. In this case, we're discussing really a whole different approach to understanding the role of large hoofed animals on grasslands. For those of us who studied desertification, as I did when I was a student at UC Berkeley, you might know that the conventional wisdom decades ago was that the cause of desertification in the Sahelian belt of Africa was the herds of cattle, that the agro-pastoral people who've been there for thousands of years, that it was their fault that they had too many cattle, and that the cattle were denuding the grassland and spreading the desert, and the Sahara was moving south. One of the major proponents of that idea has since given a TED talk where he really regrets how wrong he was about the role of large hoofed animals on the savanna of the Sahelian belt of Africa. So when I saw that Marcy Evans and Frank Fitzpatrick are addressing this problem of desertification, and that they actually have a lot of knowledge about large hoofed animals, it is really a pleasure for me to introduce their foundation, Herd, and Marcy and Frank today to lead us through their presentation on how they see the rather unconventional approaches to raising animals today. When we think of coalinga, right? We think of CAFOs. And this is the alternative to the industrialization of meat, which has happened as a result of the concentrated animal feeding operations. So we're going to learn something here that bet, I'm going to say us all had no idea. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Frank. Go ahead, take it away.
Good morning. I'm Frank Fitzpatrick. Marcy Evans is with me today. And I'm a 45-year cattleman. I own 5 bar beef, and I've had a closed herd of Barzona cows for 45 years. And in 1982, I was introduced to Alan Savory, who is the founder of holistic management, for lack of a better word. But anyway, for the last 40 years, I've been working on the premise of how do you make the environment better on every place that you run cows on. And let's start the slideshow. Marcy, can you run that?
Yeah, do you want me to run?
What's that?
I can do it. I'll run.
I can do it. Hold on. Here we go. Can you still see my screen?
We may need to have you do it.
Can you see the PowerPoint, Frank?
Nope, we're not on yet.
Okay,
Okay. Lisa thinks she can do it.
but I just shared it. Can, Beth, do you see my screen?
Yep, there
Yes.
we go.
You can see it now.
All right.
Okay. So just tell me next, and then, you know, when you want me to take over, Frank, I can. I'm the executive director of the Heard Foundation. Frank started. It's a nonprofit to help educate the public and politicians about how such that preserves wildlife habitat, improves the soil, and you know, helps regenerative have food that's richer. So you know where your food came from locally. Go ahead, Frank, take it away. Just tell me next, and I'll go next.
All right. Anyway, anybody looking at this picture can tell you that there's not a whole lot of environmental degradation going on here. Okay, cows are not ruining the planet. They have been here for millions and millions of years. We've been eating them for about 3.2 million years. And the symbiotic relationship between humans and their ruminants is absolutely epic in its dimension and scope. However, as man has progressed through the world, he's always trying to get something for nothing. So he's trying to make the cows produce more on less, in more efficient for less money. And in doing so, we finally decided that we have not put anything back in the land that we've taken this from. If you study history for the last 8 or 10,000 years, everywhere man has been with his herds of cattle, he's turned it into a desert. And then he's moved on. And the problem is right now we're at the point in time on the planet where we have no place else to go. We either fix our problem or we perish here. Alan Savory, what he basically pointed out was that the large, can you change slides?
Next slide, Marcy.
She's trying.
Sorry about that. Okay, we're good.
Okay, I think it's the third one we want right now. Okay. Back up one. Okay.
Sorry, Frank, what?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So we're going the wrong way. I'm so sorry. Okay, so these are Frank's cows on here, and we're going to talk today, you know, about how is it like the introduction said, regenerating soil and water with cows. So it's not the cow, it's the how. It's how you do it. On the left is a conventional feedlot with cows packed in, you know, they're not grazing grass, they're eating corn. On the right is what we call regenerative ranching or holistic planned grazing, using electric fence or other ways to keep cows packed in, but not in grass, and moving them oftentimes a day in some areas, depending on the climate, to keep the grass growing. Okay, do you want to read this, Frank?
What's that?
You want me to read this, or do you want to?
We'll go back to the screen for just a second.
Okay.
Two of the major secrets that Alan Savory has discovered that will allow us to drive the environment back to a sustainable level is that overgrazing isn't eating too much grass. Overgrazing is actually eating an individual grass plant before it's had time to regenerate its root systems. Now, I've got a college degree in cows, and I read 40 or 50 books on range management, and none of these books have a definition of overgrazing. And the reason they don't is nobody knows what it is until Alan Savory articulated it succinctly. Okay, you can eat grass right into the ground And if you get your cows off of it, give it a shot of water and a shot of sunshine, 30 to 180 days later, after it's had a chance to regenerate its complete root system and put a third leaf and stem back up, you have completely recycled the plant to its climax community. Next one. Marcy, can you change slides?
So this slide is a quote from Judith Schwartz, reviewing Alan Savory. So it's not the quantity of rain that falls, rather how usable or effective that rainfall is. How many trillions of gallons of water will have been lost? A full inch came down in a short time, leading to flooding. Next day, the land was bone dry. All that rain did, nothing to nourish the land, thirsty as it might have been. So she's describing watching rainfall in Africa, very close to where Alan Savory's regenerative ranch is. Go ahead, Frank.
Okay. The problem in arid and brittle environments with seasonal rainfall, which is where we're at in Southern California. You got a 7 or 8 month dry period and a 4 or 5 month wet period. And the reason our environments are shrinking is the link we're missing is that the majority of decay of the plant matter in the world is biological. If you stand it up, rest the ground, wind, water, and metabolic decay is very, very, very inefficient. And it keeps our environments in a stagnant position. Healthy soils need to be eaten and then rested. And if by doing this, the hoof action of the cows actually permeates the soil, which allows more water to percolate in, more grass plants to sprout. And if you can do that in a large enough, and I don't know what the word form I'm looking for is, but if you can get enough animals on the ground, you can actually change succession with the migrations of herds. Can you go to the next slide?
So on the left is an example of when there's no green grass growing, like for a place that's either cement, so you have compaction, or a place with any place that's been undergrazed or overgrazed, where you don't have green growing plants for whatever reason. You have rainfalls and the water loss just runs off. It doesn't go into the ground, so the soil bakes and gets dry. On the right is an example of what happens on our ranch or other regenerative ranches, where rain falls, the green plants, it falls on the green plants and they suck it down in the roots and they create soil organic matter inside the soil, and you're recreating the small water cycle. So right now, Alan, you all have watched the TED Talk, or we'll share a link afterwards on Alan Savory. He talked about most of the world grasslands in the area are becoming deserts, and that's actually the missing link between climate change and global warming and all the environmental degradation things. It's actually not just in the air, it's actually in the soil, because soil can be a huge carbon sink, because that's where the fossil fuels came from, right? Is oil underground. So if you repair our deserts and fix kind of our small water cycles, you can then get to the bigger problems, the larger water cycles, and stop these cycles of huge floods and huge wildfires and deserts. But how is healthy soil created? Frank, you want to take this one?
Yeah, you're gonna go to the next slide with the cows.
You
Okay.
want this one, or?
Yep, that's the perfect one. Okay, this is the missing link right here. We've been staring at it all of our lives on the Serengeti. This is a massive herd of multi-species, mostly ruminant animals that are grazing on a piece of ground. The animal impact on this ground is something between 300,000 to 1 million pounds of hooves per acre. Now it doesn't have to be there very long. The impact can only be for like 15 minutes and then move. But these vast herds of animals are tromping on the ground. They're chiseling the soil. So they're actually the tractor and plow of the environment. And they can get in areas, many, many, many more areas than tractors and conventional farming methods do. Then, in this particular instance, you got herds of lions and wolves, and well, not wolves here, but you got lions, wolves, pack hunting animals, dogs that are moving these herds of cattle and eating the weak and the sick and infirmed off of the problem. This is causing a kind of a breathing on the environment. These animals are packing together, dispersing to graze, packing together, dispersing to graze, bunching at night, spreading out in the morning. This pulse is actually changing the succession of our environment.
So since we don't have wolves anymore, right, in California, in Los Angeles, or in Orange County, we got to do something to mimic that with our cattle. So regenerative cattle ranching, moving the cows with horses, with virtual fence collars, with electric fence, bunching them just like the wolves or the big cats of Africa would have done, or in the United States, wolves and other pack hunting predators of the bison. Then you're going to recreate the great grasslands of the past, like that was in the Great Plains of the United States, as well as the Central Valley of California, as well as any place that's flat, like Orange County and Los Angeles, before the Spanish came. Go ahead, Frank.
Okay, one of the things that's interesting to me about our environmental degradation is the only known records we have of what the environment was like prior to the white man coming to California, basically the Sistabal's diary of the move from Santa Cruz to San Francisco with Portola and Junipero Serra. And they're really not environmental treatises, but there's anecdotes in there all the way along and all the way up about what the environment was like when they got here. Now, in 1778, Portola tied a square knot over the top of his Andalusian stallion with green grass. It was August 28th, 1778. He was 140 degrees west, 32.7 degrees north, which is basically Fountain Valley. 230 years ago, Orange County had a grassland savanna that was growing green grass beet 8 feet tall in July and August. That's because the plant species were perennial. We had big, large moving herds of elk that actually sustained that environment. And the minute we broke this up into haciendados and started ranching conventionally, all of that went away, and it didn't take very long. Come next slide.
So on the left is showing bare ground, right? On the right is the grass, the native or the soil, the healthy soil that we're creating with our bunched herds. On the left is just one single cow, right? And that's just not enough animal impact. So there's but you can have overgrazing where you just graze them, like you have them on the land too long and you're not moving them enough, but also overrest is almost as bad. Overrest is what happens in a lot of these nature preserves, both in Los Angeles and Orange County, where cattle were taken off the land nature preserves were left alone to quote, recover or rest. However, we never added back in the original grazers, right? So no bison, no tule elk. There's like seven little deer that wander around our mountains. And I know in Los Angeles, it's the same thing. You know, most of it's cement. But these big nature preserves, which are wonderful for hiking, if you ever are hiking in one of them, you'll see there's actually a lot of bare ground. And there's a lot of plants that are not biologically decaying, like Frank was saying. They're actually turning gray or dusty, kind of black, and that's called they're having to degrade oxidatively instead of with bacteria and biologically. Do you have anything else to say about this slide, Frank?
Nope.
So here's more of a definition of what is holistic planned grazing. We've covered some of this. Basically, we're using humans to mimic the predators that would move the cattle or other big grazing animals. And both undergrazing and overrest can lead to the cancer of desertification, as Alan Savory says. Go ahead, Frank.
All right, this is a picture of, this is what we call a night herd. When we're moving these cattle rapidly in a high growth scenario, you put these things in here, those cattle are standing shoulder to shoulder. There's about 600 head of them, and they'll be there overnight. In the first thing in the morning, you kick them out on the next piece of grass. If you look at these places in succession behind the grazing plans, these places with high animal impact have the most biodiversity. They've got the most holes in the ground, and they retain the most water. Can you give me the next slide?
So here's another example of a desertifying ranch on the left, a holistically managed ranch on the right. And if you come out for one of our ranch tours in Trabuco Canyon, which is right on the border of Riverside County and Orange County in the Santa Ana Mountains, it won't be this dramatic right now in the green growing season, but in August, you know, you can see a big difference. This is in South Africa, where they only get 8 inches of rainfall a year. We in Orange County and LA get about, on average, 14 inches of rainfall, but it can vary greatly, right, Frank?
As little as 4 this year, we got 41. And when you're looking at this picture, the thing you want to remember is the desertifying place on the left is the national park in Africa. And they have been, and Alan actually started this 40 years ago, systematically taking the large animals off of the land. And as they take it off, this thing desertifies. The place on the right is a pretty nicely stocked, holistically planned grasslands. And if you look at the biodiversity there, except for in the tire tracks, it would be hard to stick your finger in the ground and not find a grass plant.
So we talked a bit about the definition of holistic planned grazing. Here are some of the benefits. And on the lower right is actually a picture of our ranch in Orange County. That's Lake Mission Viejo and Oso Reservoir, and you were looking out west to the Pacific Ocean over those little coastal mountain ranges. So, you know, we're building healthy soil. We're restoring the watershed by increasing soil water penetration and retention. We're increasing the biodiversity, nutrition, and resiliency of plants and animals. We're creating wildlife habitat. We work with the Audubon Society to help make sure that grassland bird habitat is great. It is protected because different birds want different levels of places to nest. They actually won't nest in some of the nature preserves where the grass is so high because they can't see predators coming. Holistic plant grazing can increase soil organic matter, which helps regenerate healthy soil. And it's also a carbon sink. A lot of people are talking about making technology, right, to get carbon out of the atmosphere when we already have the technology biologically. It's a cow and the grass. And if the grass is green and growing, it's actually taking in carbon dioxide and creating oxygen and bringing that out of the atmosphere. Also, very important for all of us in Southern California, mitigate wildfire risk and flood risk. We've been every single year is, quote, the worst fire year ever. And a lot of that is because these nature preserves have been left to grow 12-foot high annual grasses. So when you do that, that creates wildfire fuel. And then eventually after the fires, you'll get floods, soil erosion, and all these things. Do you have anything else to add, Frank?
Yeah, we had a bird inventory this last year on the ranch in Orange County. And Orange County has a big 4,200 acre bird preserve. And they hadn't seen a meadowlark over there on their ranch in the last 4 or 5 years. And you've got to kick 50 or 60 of them out of the way to drive up to the corral at my place. This thing really, really works as far as getting the total environment to start cycling back to a sustainable level. You're creating habitat in all instances for all the animals involved. This resting program that the environmentalists have had for the last 60 years have completely ruined our environment. These people ought to be shot and completely held responsible for their degradations that they've created in the environment. And they've done it basically with donations from well-wishing people that think that somebody that goes to college and gets a degree can figure out the complexity of a natural environment. Next slide, please.
So if you have healthy soil, there's actually more microbes and creatures living, protozoas, bacteria, all sorts of things in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on the planet. If you have bare soil in some of these overgrazed places, there will actually be dead, sterile soil. So to finish up again, it's not the cow, right? It's the how. Both overgrazing and undergrazing are both really bad. 40% of the world's land is grassland. And so since we've decimated the big herds of bison and tule elk, or in Africa, zebras and different other creatures, I'm not saying you can't rewild and bring those back in, but in the meantime, we're losing grassland habitat at an incredible rate, and especially grassland birds are very endangered and going extinct. And we're ruining our soil, right, with the big wildfires and the development, the construction. So the task of cattle is to make rainfall more effective, to bring soil health back, get the ecosystem cycling correctly, and have a local food source as well. So it's a win-win. So this is a little bit about our nonprofit, the Herd Foundation. Our mission is to promote holistic planned grazing as a form of regenerative agriculture to solve our water, fire, and environmental crisis. One of the big problems in Orange County is there's 130,000 ungrazed acres because, again, with good intentions, environmentalists set them aside. But we need to bring back big, large, hoofed ruminant mammals to graze it to get the ecosystem restarted. So this is a picture of Frank on his horse Nick giving a ranch tour on the ranch in Orange County to the public as well as to politicians. We've had the mayor of Irvine out. We have a project with the toll roads, a 3-year pilot project looking at how grazing affects native plant lands and soil health with some control plots. So we're doing different things, trying to prove this scientifically, as is the Savory Foundation with their ecological outcome verification monitoring. And they have been out to our ranch. We're enrolled in that program as well. Go ahead, Frank. 230,000. I said it wrong.
This is the slide I like. There's 230,000 acres of undeveloped land remaining ungrazed in Orange County. Now, every year we burn this down. This particular fire, which was the Canyon Fire 2, burnt 6,000 acres. It got 620 homes. It got 0 homes on the fire line. Every single house that was confronted with fire, they saved. The county made everybody evacuate, and the 600 homes that burnt or ember fires that started inside the fire line. This is all due to the fact that we've got a big brushscape environment, which is the coastal sage scrub. And the problem with the environment is by leaving it alone, we've turned the thing into a tinderbox. Most of this brush in our country is dead at all times. We're not recycling the environment. The carbon is not recycling. And what we're doing is we're perpetuating the problem. If we had grasslands and shrublands in front of these fires, you could put these fires out with a gunny sack and hot water and cold water. The thing I try to tell people is that when you're burning brush, these embers that burn are a wick. They burn on both ends. In a 60-mile-an-hour wind, they'll go a half a mile above the fire line and start another fire. If you're burning grass in front of it, the thing tenderizes, vaporizes quickly, and the overburden of, they're not sparks, but basically embers pushing forward in a fire when in grasslands and several stage scrubs is many, many times less than if in these big brush piles. And this grazing goes a long ways to stopping the Holocaust fire situation in year number 1. In year number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what you're basically trying to do is get the environment to cycle back to a perennial bunch grass and browse environment. And as you do this, you get more and more perennials growing. You increase your water cycle, which is actually lengthening your green feed season. Now, if there was green grass on August 28, 1778 in Orange County, there's no reason we can't do that again. Any questions?
Hey.
So there are
please
some
do.
questions, Frank, but we'll get them at the end. This is just some more pictures of the ranch tours. And yeah, some more, you can see we're right next to houses. So by grazing in a holistic plan manner, we're protecting those homes right across the street from wildfire risk. And I like this quote. It's Frank gave it to me, or us. Despite all of our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact it rains. So all of us 3 times a day are thanking farmer ranchers for the food we eat. So how we grow it and how, like, what food choices we make at the grocery store and the restaurants really matters. And these are some of our sponsors and some of our partners. So go ahead, Beth. I can see the questions, or if you're going to read them.
We've got a pile of them. So we have about 6 or 7 minutes to answer them. So I'm going to start with Eugene and Lewis's question. How do you reconcile the need for protected natural areas as greenhouse sinks with the need for natural grazing areas?
What is a greenhouse sink?
A
Do you
greenhouse
mean
sink.
a carbon sink?
I would think that's,
Yes, a carbon sink.
thank you,
So-
Eugene.
So like a forest, or what? I'm still. So the thing that we're trying to say is a lot of these protected natural areas are becoming carbon sources because they're not being degraded biologically by a bison or a cow or a big grazing animal. They're just decaying by chemical oxidation instead of biologically, because there's no microbes living anymore there, because there's not enough deer or other creatures to degrade it. Do you have so I guess I'm confused a little bit. Maybe can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, maybe I can just say what I'm saying, because there's a big advocacy for preserving natural areas, 30 by 30 campaign.
Yeah.
Because we want to have preserved carbon sinks where carbon can be absorbed by the land.
But the carbon is not absorbed by the land. The carbon is put into the ground by the cows.
And healthy soil.
Through their manure. So they eat the carbon that's in the plant, right? The plant itself is taking dioxide in during the day, releasing oxygen. At night that reverses, right? And then the cow itself is eating carbon in the form of plant matter and then goes through the rumen of the cow. The pH of a cow's rumen is the same as the pH of healthy soil. So they're actually inoculating the ground with healthy microbes to help create soil health in the ground. Right, Frank?
Absorbs the carbon.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, doing
Well,
holistic
there
plant
are
grazing or
no-
go ahead.
There are no rested environments worldwide that are anywhere near healthy. You cannot take environments and put them at rest. They will decay, and eventually all of them will turn to desert.
So I think to answer the 30 by 30 question and some of California's proposals, there's climate smart agriculture proposals or working lands programs where you have these nature preserves, you are carefully monitoring them and allowing cattle or sheep or goat grazing or bison or whatever grazing animal of your choice and monitoring it in such a manner where it's not overgrazed, but it's also not undergrazed, right? So it's not over rested or under rested. There's a balance, and humans are bad at figuring that out. Nature itself is much better at figuring that out.
Well,
Does
she
that
had
answer the
24
question?
billion years to figure it out.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Eugene?
Yes, I think it's just understanding how to balance all these things, you know. when
There's
you-
no balance to it. We're gonna have to graze the environment, get our major cow herds back, or we're gonna perish.
Yeah. Unless we can,
I mean,
get
all this
20
other
million
stuff,
bison, but that won't work, right? Because
right?
if you have bison there by the houses, that's going to create a public relations nightmare.
Sheep don't do it because they don't have enough. Goats don't do it. Buffalo are too damn wild. The only chance we've got as a species is cows.
Which leads us to our next question. It talks about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, really interesting discussion. Thank you. So the next question is, and Denise has a ton of questions, so I'm gonna try to we don't have that much time left, but I'll try to pick through. So one is, would it make sense to use the land to grow fruits and vegetables rather than to feed animals? Because the animals need to be slaughtered.
Oh,
Do you want to take that one, Frank?
okay. This is a really nice picture we're looking at right here, and you could probably grow some fruits and vegetables here. But if you turn the camera around 360 degrees, this is about the only spot you can see that you can get a tractor on. Okay, there are millions and millions and millions of ungrazed acres in the world that you can't get a tractor on. Okay, and if you're worried about killing things, monocrop farming kills more animals by the pound than grazing animals do. So, I mean, that's just
Well, you don't have to do monocrop farming. You could do multi-crop farming.
doesn't matter what you do, unless you get somebody out there to hand pick your crops, you're going to kill all the snakes, squirrels, bugs, rabbits, rats, moles, and
Box.
no, you're not going to kill them, but you kill the birds.
Yeah, because the machines that we use to efficiently pick fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables, they run over, I mean, all these little creatures. Like, I can't tell you how we have horses,
They
how many
wipe it
times
out.
we've
They
found
completely
dead snakes,
sterilize
dead
the ground.
rabbits in the hay bales or and it happens in produce. It's something we don't want to think about because we're so disconnected from where our food comes from. But the tractors murder lots of baby rabbits every single year, and snakes and moles and everything he just said. So I understand, the big problem a lot of people, especially in cities, have about the morality of beef cattle. Even if not a single person ate meat, we still need grazing large mammals on the land. And the cow, like we talked about, is the one that makes the most sense because bison would just run over all of our houses and cars.
I'm gonna just add a couple of those questions up together too, is that are large factory farms, or is there movement in industry to move towards this regenerative methods of cattle raising or land support?
Yeah.
And then how do we know who's doing that?
Okay, when I started selling meat 23 years ago, grass-fed beef was basically about 2.2% of the national market. Now it's about 7.5%. So we've actually tripled the amount of, I'm trying to say hopefully here, correct grazing practices for about another 5 or 6% of the industry over 20 years. That's an actually small leap, but the problem is, unfortunately, the guys that own the ground that we're running the cows on right now are gonna have to die off, and some kid coming up behind them is gonna have to start taking over and doing these practices. It is hard to get people that hold factors of production to change their mind when they've been doing something for 40 years. Problem is, they just will not change.
All right, and then I'm gonna jump to another question, our last one, because we have to move on to our next speaker. But so the question is, if we're not the only dry environment, has holistic planned grazing been a known factor worldwide, and is it being practiced a lot, or has it been progressing, and are people becoming more aware? So it's kind of like that last question, but
Yeah.
maybe international.
The biggest example is Patagonia. They run 25,000 sheep in Tierra del Fuego, and the improvements that they've made to the land down there over the last 20 years are staggering. Savory Institute runs hubs in Africa. Mexico has 3 big outfits running now that are doing a really good job. There's savory hubs in England. Australia's got a bunch of them. I just found out there was one in Turkey.
Yeah, it's in Istanbul. Yep.
The problem is that doing this thing changes everything. As soon as somebody can get a hold of the factors of production, I'm talking about land, labor, money, and cows, and can put these things in situations together, they make perfect sense because they make more money. And the problem is you can't get people that have been doing things for 40 years to change quick enough to make this thing sustainable at this point.
All right.
I want to address one last thing before we end real fast. Just sorry, as somebody asked, isn't it more efficient to grow fruits and vegetables because beef cattle takes too much feed and water? So no, it's not. And then nobody even brought up the methane question. But in a natural environment like this, not in a feedlot, the methane is actually, there's a small little methane cycle that's very natural because of the green growing grass. In the feedlot, that cycle is disrupted. And here we're not trucking in food. We're not growing food for these cows. They are part of the natural ecosystem. Okay, so even though there's a lot of data out there about how beef cattle use a lot of water, if you are grazing them in this kind of system, it's not. It's more efficient to do this actually than fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables, especially in California, take a lot of water.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Marcy and Frank. That was really enlightening. And you can see we had a very vibrant kind of conversation here.
Thank you very much for having us.
And we will, I just want to ask everybody, please, to fill out, if you're leaving, fill out our survey. We'll post it again at the beginning of, or the end of our next speaker, but we want to make sure that we get your feedback and hear what you have to say. Thank you so much. You so appreciate what you came in and participated with us. So back to you, George.
Well, thank you, Beth. Indeed, Frank and Marcy, you really made us think. And that's why we hold these seminars, because actually our biggest audience is faculty. So I think you've probably dislodged a lot of conventional ideas that we've been holding that are probably not fact-based or based on science. So you've really brought a fresh look at something that I think it will give it a think. It's a much needed aspect of deepening our environmental knowledge. It's not, we had actually planned for the program a 5-minute break. I don't know, Beth, if it was supposed to be 10:25 to 10:30, we could still have a little bio break, as we call it, and reconvene, or should we go ahead into our next set
Let's
of
make
days?
it a 3-minute bio break.
A 3-minute bio break. Okay, let's do that. So I will do that. Oh, what's it doing? Mhm. Chat. Emails, question, password, emails. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll resume back at 3:30, at 10:30, 10:34. So we'll be just a little bit behind, but I think we'll be all right.
Hey, voila. Hello, Hannah Barlow.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're very happy to have you. This is a very special day for us. And so far, a very different kind of Earth Day for the Sustainable Environment Institute. In many ways, we are learning rather than regurgitating what we learned about climate and so on. We're learning as faculty from people presenting today. So we did start out with the fashion and apparel industry, which was a true eye-opener. and we've just had a presentation on ranching, range ranching, and the ecological complexity of large hoofed animals on grasslands. We could have spent 3 hours on it because it did provoke all kinds of interesting discussion, including the issues of ethics around animal raising, but also understanding the complexity of dry climate environments where hoofed animals play a very big role. So I had my conventional wisdom turned a little upside down, and I have a feeling it's about to happen again.
Yeah, I was able to hop on at the tail end of that last presentation. I was like, wow, these are great questions. I don't know if I'm prepared
Really good
if we got that same rigor of questions after my presentation, but I do hope it's a
get
learning
ready
experience.
because I am sure I should tell people that Hannah Barlow is with the Good Food Institute. She's the academic community coordinator. It's a nonprofit and it's dedicated to advancing foundational open access research in alternative proteins. Now, that is a mouthful because most of us hear that and say, what is that? But because when we dealt with the cattle ranching, of course, that is the meat industry, which is a major source of protein for modern urban people in the United States, especially. We consume phenomenal quantities of beef and pork and chicken. And it has environmental problems that are inherent to it, particularly as they pointed out, the more efficient the system gets, in a sense, the more wasteful, the more environmentally damaging. That the altar of efficiency is what leads to the CAFOs and the horror shows of antibiotics and steroids and hormones and all the rest of the package, which is why I think another hour on that one would have been good, because that was probably coming. So you're dealing with something that is completely different. And so you're here, you're going to let us have a think about what it is that your company does, that your foundation does, to advance the idea that, no, we don't actually have to derive our protein from large hoofed animals.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it'll be fun to have these presentations directly back to back. But I will share my screen. All right. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, hi everyone. My name is Hannah Barlow, and as George said, I work at the Good Food Institute as one of our academic community coordinators, and I'm super excited to be here and meet you all and talk a little bit more about what alternative proteins are and their place within a more sustainable food system. So over the next 25-30 minutes or so, I'll discuss what they are, my work at GFI, the environmental need for a better food system, and the pivotal role that students play within the alt protein movement. And so just want to add an asterisk here. I definitely prepared this presentation with the thought that my audience would be primarily students, but I will try to shift some of my language and such to reflect that there is a heavy faculty presence as well. But that being said, I still definitely do want to stress the importance of students and universities within this movement. So we'll get to that towards the end. But with that being said, after my talk, there will, of course, be time for questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat throughout or ask them live after. All right, let's get started. So first of all, what is GFI? For those of you not familiar yet with the Good Food Institute or GFI, I'll share a little bit more about our organization. So we are an international nonprofit focused on creating a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. GFI works in the most critical economies and regions for alternative protein advancement, including, of course, the US, but also the Asia Pacific region, Brazil, Europe, India, and Israel. And we're currently looking to expand with additional funding that we're receiving. And as a global think tank, GFI seeks to advance alternative protein science and research, mobilize resources and talent, and help partners across the food system, such as yourselves, to develop successful alternative protein strategies and advance the industry as a whole. And so as a nonprofit, 100% powered by philanthropy, we play a unique role within the alternative protein space. First of all, we are able to share knowledge freely in a field where many innovators seek novel solutions to the same set of problems. GFI's research data and insights are open access and support the progress of every innovator in this space. We're not motivated by trying to sell our own products, and thus we have to gatekeep certain knowledge or advancements. We're all about sharing this research with everyone so that the entire industry can advance. Nextly, we focus on the white spaces of the industry. We seek to advance high impact and tractable solutions in areas where too few people are working. And lastly, we take a big picture perspective. So GFI works across the plant-based and cultivated industries, which I will explain in more depth a little bit later. We work across the public and private sectors, and of course, through international borders and into future decades. And so we seek to spot and address today's industry-wide challenges while forecasting and averting future obstacles. So with that being said, I'm going to go over a little bit more about our current food system. And it sounds like a lot of this may be a little bit redundant or repetitive to some of you, so my apologies. All right, as many of you may know, our current industrial animal agriculture system is a leading cause of some of our world's most pressing problems. At GFI, we kind of focus on 4 core issues: environmental devastation, global food insecurity, public health and biosecurity risks, and animal suffering. And so the intensive production of livestock and feed crops is incredibly inefficient and leads to massive deforestation, land degradation, and soil and water pollution, which then causes harm to ecosystems and biodiversity. We also see that this system uses vast amounts of water and fossil fuels, which then contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions and overall climate change. Additionally, we see the waste produced by these animals then polluting the air, water, and soil, and posing serious health risks to workers and surrounding communities. And then we see that the overuse of antibiotics, and other drugs in animal agriculture further contribute to the rise of antibiotic-resistant diseases, posing a very significant public health threat. I also don't need to talk more about zoonotic diseases, but we also see alternative proteins as a solution to preventing the next pandemic and reducing our exposure to animals and new diseases. But finally, we see that the intensive confinement and mistreatment of animals in the industrial animal agriculture system results in immense animal suffering and cruelty. And so that was a lot. We won't get into all 4 of these in depth today, just for the sake of time. I'll try to focus in more on the specific environmental damages. But anyways, while we see traditional animal agriculture poses so many threats to humanity, and it's becoming increasingly well known that our current food system has devastating impacts, meat demand across the world is still growing. People want to eat meat, whether it's because of the cultural significance it has, the convenience, or even just their taste preferences. We cannot easily expect everyone to afford or even desire to remove meat and other animal products completely from their diet. While we can hope for that, and many individuals across the US and the world have chosen vegan or vegetarian diets to really shift our global food system, we believe that we cannot expect everyone to be able to just completely shift away from meat and other animal products. And so, we see that while the demand for meat will continue to grow, so will the global population. And as I'm sure we all know, and we've kind of hinted at, our current food system is depleting the earth of its land and natural resources, and yet we're still not producing enough. And so there are people all around the world already facing food insecurity and malnutrition. And that's even before our global population continues to grow. And so the key question that we often come back to with GFI is, how will we feed 10 billion people by 2050? And how will we do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely? And so our solution and our answer to this is alternative proteins. We believe that the answer to this question is to make the meat, egg, and dairy products that people love in a more sustainable and efficient way. What if we can reduce the harmful impacts that animal agriculture has on climate change, land use, biodiversity, public health, and animal welfare without compromising taste or price? This is the central goal of alternative proteins and the Good Food Institute. And so just to dive in a little bit more onto what alternative proteins are, they are proteins produced from plant or animal cells or by way of fermentation. So these innovative foods are designed to taste the same or better than conventional animal products while costing the same or less. Compared to conventionally produced products and proteins, alternative proteins require fewer inputs, such as land and water, and generate far fewer negative externalities, such as greenhouse gas emissions and waste pollution. And so just to break this term down even further, there are three key pillars of production: plant-based, fermentation, and cultivated. Oh, I think I skipped one. There we go. All right, so first of all, we have the plant-based alternative proteins. And so with these plant-based meats, the meat textures and flavors are derived from plant cells and proteins. These are the most common on the market currently. With anything like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods, we see these as probably, the most popular and affordable on the market right now. Although we still are obviously doing research within the market and on the science sides to continue seeking price parity with traditional meats. Next, we have fermentation-derived meats, which to me is maybe the most confusing because it's just this realm of microorganisms that feels hard to conceptualize. But fermentation-derived meat uses microorganisms to produce meat alternatives rather than plant cells, like we saw previously. And so on the simplest level, fermentation for meat production works like how fermentation creates cheese, beer, and kombucha. But more complex techniques like precision-derived fermentation are able to reprogram microorganisms so that they produce new substances that we can then use for meat production. And lastly, we have cultivated meat, which is maybe the most technologically advanced or exciting pillar because it's genuine animal meat, but it's made directly from animal stem cells. But it then does not require the raising or farming of these animals, despite still being real animal meat. And there's obviously a lot more science behind each of these pillars, and we have really helpful deep dives on our website that go into the intricacies of each of these pillars and the science behind them. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the environmental benefits of alternative proteins. So here's an overview of 5 core areas of environmental damage that our current animal agricultural system is driving. As you can see, for all 5 categories, land use, water use, air pollution, toxic chemicals, and greenhouse gas emissions, conventional beef, unsurprisingly, has the highest impact with anywhere from 41 to 67 times the impact as plant-based meat. And so just to dive in a little bit deeper into each of these 5 core environmental damages, with land use, we see that the massive amount of land use that our current agricultural system has is due to not only the plants that feed livestock that we need to grow, but also, of course, raising the livestock themselves. And so with all of this land, animal agriculture is unsurprisingly the leading cause of global deforestation, and over 75% of the approximately 5 million hectares of deforested land is driven by agriculture. And then breaking this down even further, based on human consumption patterns from around the world, this averages to about 4 trees per person per year being cut down as a result of our diets. And so here's a little bit of a deeper look, a life cycle based on a life cycle analysis at land use used for traditional meat versus land use used for plant-based meat, cultivated meat, etc. So here we can see that beef from beef cattle is 158 times the amount of land used for its plant-based meat alternatives. And even our cultivated meat options, which do require some amount of land, given the fact that it's using animal stem cells, still requires 149 times less land. And with the drastic amount of land that is deforested and depleted through animal agriculture, we're also seeing devastating impacts on our global biodiversity. Due to overexploitation, agriculture, and other human-caused drivers, we're losing species at a rate that is tens to thousands of times faster than the previous mass extinction events in Earth's history. And of our global biomass of all mammals, only 4% of that is made up of wild animals, while 60% is from livestock alone. But luckily, alternative proteins can address this land loss, and biodiversity loss, not just through the significantly lower amount of land that is needed for alternative proteins, but also through new research that explores new biomes and plant species from around the world that then we can use to more sustainably feed our growing population. And so rather than using the same plant species like soy and wheat, we can promote native plant species, which then consequently promotes forest conservation, enhances sustainable food products, and boosts local economic development for the communities surrounding those native species. For example, you can see here, our GFI Brazil team obviously has a massive amount of land and biodiversity that they are then doing research on to find new plant species to explore within the alternative protein sphere. In addition to the impacts of land use and biodiversity loss, animal agriculture also uses huge fractions of water and causes excessive water pollution. We see that about 29% of the average global consumer's water footprint is from animal products. And while using this system uses so much water, it's also polluting our water at high rates. Farms raising livestock and poultry produce hundreds of tons of manure each year, which then leads to 13 times more waste than the entire US population. And then this waste often leaks out of storage centers and facilities due to storms and floods, further contaminating our water supply. And so similar to the land use analysis we saw earlier, here's one where we can directly compare water use, where we see that once again, traditional beef from beef cattle is significantly beating our plant-based and cultivated options in terms of water use. And the last category that I'll focus on today in terms of environmental damage is our greenhouse gas emissions. So our current animal agricultural system emits carbon dioxide through the energy and fossil fuels used to maintain the equipment and facilities, in addition to, of course, the carbon dioxide that's being exhaled by livestock themselves. Additionally, and I'm sorry if this is obvious to many of you, but additionally, we see livestock and their manure contributing to our methane levels. And lastly, soil depletion and again, the manure are also contributing to nitrous oxide entering our atmosphere. So between carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, animal agriculture is warming our atmosphere at extremely harmful rates. But with alternative proteins, we can directly reduce animal emissions, obviously by removing animals and their waste from the process, but also through taking the opportunity that with this new field of research and all the development that is to come with alternative proteins and our facilities, we can make sure that we're utilizing renewable energy resources so that we can further reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not employing oil and other fossil fuels to maintain our systems. All right, that was a lot. And the bright side of it being repetitive is maybe it's a little bit less doom and gloom to many of you than a lot of my audiences are. But I just want to, as I always do, end with how we see hope and what GFI believes is the answer. And so, yeah, we at GFI see a solution and are passionate about building a better food system through alternative proteins. And in particular, myself and my team have seen the potential students have in leading a better food system. And I see a hand up. I'll definitely make sure to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So let's just really quickly kind of dive into the role that students play. So we see students not only as the future scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs, and politicians of our world, but also as current leaders. Oftentimes it's framed that students will eventually be significant and thus we should value them. But we see that students are often the first ones and the primary ones on their campuses in their communities who are seeking new solutions and novel solutions to some of our world's most pressing problems. And so that's why my team created the Alt Protein Project, which is a program that I work with, and it's GFI's overall program for supporting and empowering students who are passionate about alternative proteins. It's a global student movement dedicated to turning universities into engines for alternative protein education, research, and innovation, because we believe that students are the driving force behind the alt protein movement, and they can further build momentum at their universities around the world. And so we have a core mission to harness the power of academic institutions. And we do that so that we can build up the alternative protein workforce through empowering students, educators, and industry professionals to pursue alternative proteins in their studies and careers, while pushing administrators and companies to meet these academic and research demands with new opportunities, structures, funding, etc., in the university and industry setting. Simultaneously, we see huge potential for these universities to act not only as spaces for equipping people for their workforce, but also as powerful research centers themselves, driving technological progress through faculty, postdoc, and graduate or undergraduate research. And so our goal is to train, find, and empower student leaders at key universities to build up these academic ecosystems. And so we do this by focusing on 5 core objectives listed here. So we have awareness, which is all about generating excitement and conversation about alt proteins on campus and in the surrounding communities. We have community, which is about building a safe, fun, and inviting space for students and researchers to pursue and learn about alt proteins. Education, which is about developing more classes and academic opportunities on campus to pursue alternative proteins. Research, which is of course about asking and investigating new questions to advance the science of the field. And innovation, which is about driving forward new technological advances like new products or companies in the alt protein space. And so our program is a little under 3 years old, and it began with only 5 pilot universities. And this is before I was on board, so it's especially crazy for me to think about, considering the fact that we now have 30 active chapters and are currently in the final stages of welcoming about 20 new chapters, because we just closed our applications for this next cohort. And so by the end of this year, we'll have at least 50 total student chapters from all around the world, in at least 17 countries and 5 continents. Here's a quick glimpse of our community map, where you can see some of the universities in our program, which are, of course, all around the world, from Nigeria to Australia to Germany to, of course, many here in the US. But I don't want to just focus on the numbers of our program. Let's dive into, are these students impactful? And of course, I wouldn't be here if the answer wasn't yes. So through the Alt Protein Project and the students leading their chapters, we've seen these students launch the world's first alternative protein courses on their campus. Campuses all around the world, including in the US, Stanford, Davis, UNC Chapel Hill, and Johns Hopkins, are developing courses that cover a wide range of alternative protein topics, with some of these courses doing deep technical dives into the science behind cultivated meat, to other courses that are more of a policy lens behind alternative proteins. What will it take to get this regulated on a federal or even global level? And oftentimes these classes include a new guest speaker each week, sometimes from academia, other times from an alt protein startup. And more often than not, these classes utilize the fact that students love free food and have different tastings throughout the weeks that students get to try from the alternative protein space. In addition to education, we've also seen so many students pursuing their research objective and winning funding, and while partnering with faculty and researchers on their campus to pursue new research within the alt protein space. So we see just a couple of screenshots here. I know that this slide doesn't even have some of our most recent research that students have driven. So I know that even more students at the University of Illinois, for example, have initiated new research projects in their professor's lab to look at how to cultivate alternative protein fish. And so we just constantly see students asking new questions and inviting new faculty into this research space. More often than not, or just very frequently, there are professors on these universities who have experience that's very relevant to alternative proteins, but have never, engaged in the field directly. For example, a biochemistry or material science professor. But then we see that our students are the ones initiating these conversations and bringing these faculty into the space. Whereas oftentimes we view faculty as the primary influencers, meanwhile students are the ones following. It's really cool to see a relationship where faculty and students are both contributing to these new and exciting research ideas. And on top of new research and education opportunities on campus, the APP chapters are creating exciting social opportunities and welcoming communities on their campuses. Since our founding, students have hosted over 195 community events, which can range from a tour of an alt protein startup nearby to trivia nights or a plant-based ice cream sundae night. And so hopefully hearing about the impact that students have already had within the Alt Protein Project excites you. And so there are several ways to get more involved at your university or to encourage students to do so. As I mentioned earlier, GFI has or is an open access organization. And so on our website, we have a huge database of educational resources for anyone to access, not just students. So if there are more technical questions for me after the presentation, this is probably where I'll point you to first, is our website, given just the massive amount of resources that we have. But these resources cover anything from the fundamentals and science behind alternative proteins to the policy and the market space for alternative proteins. And then on the side of creating educational content, we have an entire repository of curriculum, lesson ideas, and sample syllabi that chapters have previously used and successfully used to develop courses and modules about alternative proteins on their campus. And so we're also at your service. After all of these resources, we provide syllabus review for our Alt Protein Project chapters so that we can support them in creating new courses and connecting them even to new guest speakers. And then on the organizational side of things, our most thorough and applicable resource for students in particular is our resource hub for the Alt Protein Project. So here we have 5 resource guides for each of the objectives I mentioned earlier. And each of these guides provides really detailed practical advice and resources for creating new courses or developing your own research project, inviting new people to community events, etc. Anything that students could really think of wanting, we have a resource for it. And of course, this is open not just to our Alt Protein Project students, but everyone. And so if you're interested in leading and supporting students who are passionate about alternative proteins, I encourage you to think about joining the Alt Protein community in some way or another. And so if you are specifically interested in learning more about the Alt Protein Project and hearing when we next open our applications sometime next year, then I encourage you to fill out our interest form, which is on our website. This is how you'll stay up to date with any Alt Protein Project announcements. And when our next application cycle opens. And then on top of that, just one last plug for all the additional open access resources on our website. Because we just want to, more so than even just propelling our own program, we want to see the advancement of the Alt Protein sphere overall. And so I hope that you find that GFI's website is a treasure trove of resources and helpful information. And of course, you can feel free to contact me. My email is right here, hannahb@gfi.org, and I can try my best to answer questions or send you on over to one of our scientists who might be able to answer even more in depth your questions. And so with that, I will stop sharing and attempt to answer your amazing questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm going to just interrupt because there are lots of questions in the chat. And if it's all right with you, I'm happy to just read those out.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
get to. So All right, so let me get here. And so the first sort of comment question was, I'm trying to reconcile this with the last presentation. So I don't know how much you got to see of that, but they were talking about soil restoration through, and the importance of ruminant animals on soil to protect from desertification. And so Eugenia's question is, can we do without animals on the land and protect the soil at the same time? They've always thought that plant-based food production was a more efficient use of land. And I know that's where your perspective comes from, but I'm not sure if you could sort of address that or what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, like you said, I think that it sounds like we largely agree on the most efficient use of land in terms of food production. And I think one thing that GFI likes to focus on is that although we are advocating for a food system that no longer relies on raising and slaughtering animals, we still understand that animals will continue to live on the land, but we just want to remove and decentralize animals from our food system. And so that means we can still have the meat, but without, the intense packing of animals on land. And so oftentimes we do work with cattle ranchers and such, and we're not saying get rid of your cows, stop being a farmer. Oftentimes it's about shifting either land from producing feed crops to food crops, or it's about, we actually just watched a documentary at a staff meeting called Rowdy Girl, which was about a cattle rancher who then transitioned into raising animals as more of a sanctuary rather than raising animals to slaughter them. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but just want to underline that animals, of course, will always live on the land, but we don't want to be producing a food system that will require us to strip more and more land so that we can add more animals to this land just for the purpose of slaughtering them for food.
Thank you. And then our next, well, so there was a couple of questions in here, and I think they both relate to that issue about using ruminants in soil preservation and other things, but and I think you kind of addressed that. So the other question in that was, do you have grants? Does your organization provide grants to provide vegan food for students at an event?
That's a good question. And I can definitely answer that given I work directly with students. And so students that are part of the Alt Protein Project specifically, we give them $500 a semester, so $1,000 a year to support their events. And so a lot of times students do use this funding to have, food at their events, whether that's, plant-based ice cream or, plant-based chicken nuggets. Students get pretty creative. We've even seen students partner with alt protein startups, and rather than asking, hey, will you give us free samples, they even leverage the fact that as a college student group, they have valuable consumer insights. So we've seen chapters even get paid to eat vegan and plant-based food on campus, which is very ingenious in my opinion. But yes, we do give grants to our Alt Protein Project chapters. And then on an organizational level, GFI has a research grant program. So we have select different grantees based on our call for proposals about once or twice a year. We're about to, I think, open our next one. And so different alt protein researchers will, submit a proposal, and then GFI, doles out hundreds of thousands of dollars of research grants for these grantees.
Okay, thank you. And our own George has a question that you mentioned that animal cells are part of the elaboration of new meat-like protein foods. Can you explain if these are grown from stem cells or how the raising of the actual animal for eating replaced the animal cells?
Yeah, so with cultivated meat, I will try my best to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the science. We take animal stem cells, and then rather than, in an for example, a cow. These stem cells would then grow and develop into tissue, which would then become meat that we eat. Instead, we take it from the stem cell level, and then we don't use the cow's body to then develop those cells into tissue. We use our own bioreactors and growth serums. And so then these stem cells are then developed and grown in a lab through bioreactors that mimic what the body does to produce these cells into tissues. And so then we don't need, to raise like an entire cow for this meat. We can take just a few stem cells and create that into, a steak on its own. Or as Denise said, you could have lentil soup. And so cultivated meat, I would say, for many vegans and vegetarians, isn't really the most appealing of the three pillars, but we see cultivated meat as something that's really enticing for people that do eat meat and want to continue eating meat without without as drastic of the environmental impacts and considering animal welfare. And I will point you once again to our website where we have a deep dive on cultivated meat. And I also want to address that often or currently within the research sphere of alternative proteins, one of the growth serums that is being used by many companies is fetal bovine serum. And so GFI as an organization does not support fetal bovine serum because it is relying on the slaughter of fetal bovine. So the industry as a whole, and one thing that we are focusing on with the research that we're supporting in our own research, is finding growth serums that are no longer reliant on animals in any way. And so we just have those stem cells that we do not have to kill animals to obtain, and then we'll have natural, even plant-based growth serums to then produce animal meat. I hopefully answered your question, George, and I can also send you some more helpful links after this.
Thank you very much. I have a couple more questions here. We've just lost it. Oh, darn. Denise is suggesting that she would like to show a film or films and provide food to students. So I think she would definitely like to take you up on the grant information. And then Eugene is asking if your organization can make recommendations about how plant-based farming should be undertaken. Like what does your organization sort of point towards for that?
Yeah, so is this asking how to transition farmers into a more alternative protein focused food system?
I was talking about the kind of how land is being used for farming. I mean, the last presentation was talking about, the benefits of animals on the land. And so I guess here I'm asking, do you make recommendations about how land is used for farming, for plant-based farming, plant-oriented farming?
Yeah, I think our organization doesn't get, to my knowledge, too specific about how land is specifically used down to the techniques. I think for the most part, we have an overall focus on shifting this idea of using land to produce feed crops instead to land producing crops that we are directly eating. And so even if there is land that's still growing soy, that's soy that we want to be directly eating, rather than just soy that only 1% of its energy will contribute to a cow, which then we grow and eat, because that's just an inefficient energy transfer. And so we see that as a huge issue with, or a huge cause of why we don't produce enough food for our global population. And so I don't know if we have specific opinions. I know I have specific opinions about farming and I could safely assume that GFI is not saying, yeah, let's continue with monocropping, but instead the soy, goes towards plant-based burgers. I think there's still an understanding that we want the most sustainable farming practices for the farming that is required for alternative proteins, but even just by no longer, requiring land specifically to grow soy just to feed cattle, we're reducing the amount of land required drastically, which you may recall from that slide that was the LCA on land use. We see that like, the land required for cattle is 158 times the land required for plant-based. But yeah, my apologies. I'm not sure if GFI has an organizational stance on like, monocropping versus regenerative agriculture, because I don't know if the nuances of farming is as much our focus rather than like our overall food system and just propelling the research and innovation within the alt protein space.
Oh, gosh, thank you so much. I just last comment in here that I have a minute to say is that that Denise has put her email address in the discussion chat. So if anybody wants to.
Beth, we can't hear you. I think
Well,
we
Hannah,
lost
this has
Beth.
been a really tremendous, this whole event today has been very, very different from anything we've done in the past. And for most of us, I think it's a kind of a learning experience on all the issues we've had since we talked about fashion earlier today, the entire presentation on ranching, and now this whole concept of alternative protein, alternative meats, which some of us only know from the so-called Impossible Burgers or the and some are okay, but you shed a lot of light on it. And what's interesting to see is the growth of your organization and the degree to which you are attracting a lot of attention on college campuses. And I think a lot of it is that you're a wonderful ambassador for your organization because you really know this material. You've presented it in a way that I think is very easy to understand, and yet you drill down into some of the complexity. So we're just very grateful to have had you here at all, Hannah Barlow and GFI, and to present something that we've never talked about before on the SEI seminar series. So we're sort of getting into new ground here, and there are in the chat, there's a lot of links that were placed there for accessing the GFI website, and there's documents there. There's also some questions about films. Beth, unfortunately, her computer conked out on her middle sentence, but we can continue. She'll log back in shortly, I'm quite sure. But this really was a great presentation, Hannah, and we're really very glad that you were part of our efforts today to educate people on food. And that brings us to our next presenters. And this is continuing, of course, with our issue of food. But Melissa Larson and Massey Mayer come to us from it's Thousand Hills, and it does a whole process of regenerative agriculture. So some of you who have followed our previous discussions on climate and climate change, we have talked about the role that agriculture and the animal industry play in exacerbating the effects of climate, that is producing greenhouse gases, using fossil fuels, and wetting the entire production of food to very capital intensive and very energy intensive systems that actually makes our food systems more vulnerable, despite the high levels of efficiency and the cheapness of food that we enjoy. It's a lot of it is in a sense an illusion when we look at the fact that the only thing that separates the species from mass starvation is about 4 inches of topsoil on average. So not every farm in the world is Iowa. They don't have 4 feet of topsoil, they have 4 inches. And so that is why soil husbandry and agroecological systems and knowing how to regenerate agriculture, to have agriculture be a sink for carbon rather than a net producer, is so important to our need to confront the climate crisis. So Melissa Larson, thank you. You're from Thousand Hills, and we'll just let you take it away, and go ahead and you can share screen and do your if you have a PowerPoint presentation or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. It sounds like a great group, great discussion. Macy and I were able to join a little bit of the most recent presenter, and we appreciate the passion and the engagement here. And so we're excited. We're going to gladly talk a little bit more with you about Thousand Hills, who we are, why we're passionate about the food system, and just a little bit about what we, what we find to be important in rejuvenation of the overall food system. And so we're both here from Thousand Hills Lifetime Grazed. It is a grass-fed beef company. We are based out of Minnesota, and we work with 50-ish family farms and ranches that are around the country. We have product also available around the country. And we'll talk a little bit about how even when we talk regenerative, about what does that mean, not only for the land and the food system, the ecosystem, and kind of the regenerative principles that are associated with it, but also how we kind of navigate through the supply web and how we can rejuvenate the food system beyond agriculture as well. So my name is Melissa. Thank you. Glad to be here. We're part of the family of Thousand Hills. And Macy.
Hi, I'm Macy. I'm also with Thousand Hills, like Melissa mentioned. And yeah, happy to be here and excited to share some stuff with you guys.
I'm pulling up my PowerPoint here. Hit it in presenter mode. And so, I think there's a lot to talk about here. There's a lot to unpack. We know that there is a lot of passion behind, our previous speaker, and I'll just kind of share some of where I think there's commonalities in this, in maybe differences in approaches, but yet commonalities in beliefs, and that is thinking about feeding our people in the world well, and thinking about how we can do that in the best way possible. Animal welfare is extremely important to us. And so we'll talk about details, and we're glad to have an ongoing conversation with that. But I just want to address that there are certain commonalities that I think we can all agree on, and depending on which type of protein we're looking at here. So who we are, we've talked about family a lot, and this is a family that we work with. Our dad is Matt. He moved back to our family farm where our grandparents lived after working in the conventional food system for many years, and seeing the degradation of soil, degradation of health. Specifically, there were some bouts of cancer in our family, and just thinking about what does that mean? What was really happening, and kind of unpacking some of those questions. So now that family farm is one of 60 within Thousand Hills and the brand. And that means from an acres or footprint perspective, about 600,000 acres, which there's a couple things with that. One, we're proud of it because of how we know that those are regeneratively raised, regeneratively grown, and increasing health above and below the ground. And for people, those acres represent that. And also, we know that as the land becomes healthier, we can healthily yield more cattle on that ground versus concentrated animal feedlot, or CAFO, as we'll probably mention. And I think that's another kind of similarity or common ground that we can all come to, is that CAFOs are challenging and degrading to our health, animal health, and the overall environmental health. And so this is a prime example of why we entered into the cattle industry. I think there's no question here about why this is a challenging situation when looking at this picture. There's a human disease epidemic. Disease carries through the cattle that are highly concentrated, releasing carbon in the atmosphere. No surprise there. But the soil, and we'll talk a lot about soil and what that means to our system and what that means to our health, and the loss of biodiversity. And then, of course, grassland desertification.
And this is a global epidemic as well. Thousand Hills specifically focuses on the US. So we work with all of our producers are US based. Our products are only sold and sourced in the US, but don't let that shield from the fact that this is a global epidemic and this is happening everywhere too.
And so going back to the human health component of it, we know and we have found that health has improved based on just from our own personal experiences of consuming our product. But we're really digging into some new studies on human health, partnering with certain universities or a single university, Utah State, on linking soil health, soil health, forage health, animal health, and human health, and studying that over a 3-year time frame alongside the USDA as a funding mechanism. And that piece, as we're kind of navigating through each of the phases of that study, is continually coming back to nutrient density, the health of the protein, and directly linking that back to holistic management practices and the health of the soil. And so, although the study is not complete, we are seeing signs along the way of how this is truly important to public health as a whole. In addition to, as we're testing and monitoring our soil regeneration, and we're testing and monitoring carbon in each of our farms that we work with, watershed, animal welfare, biodiversity, and supporting the real economies. So this is kind of our broad level picture of what we consider to be regenerative principles. And notice again, we're including the social component in there, which relates back to our supply web and how we get product from the field into consumers' plates. And myself personally, I got very engaged in this because it's a family, but also because the United Nations study in 2019, which told us that our soil is degrading at such a rapid rate. We have 60 years left of harvest on this globe. And I had a baby in 2014, and that hits hard. And when I had an infant and read this report from the United Nations and looked at her and said, we have 60 years left of harvest to feed people. And then alongside that, noticed that there are studies associated with animal impact ruminants and how they can positively impact and regenerate our soil rather than degenerate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like Melissa mentioned, the personal aspect of that, like we all know people, in 60 years, imagine not being able to feed your kids, your grandkids, yourself, because the soil can no longer produce a nutrient dense crop for you to eat or your family to eat. So if you just think about it that way, it's pretty detrimental.
And as we talk about regenerative, it doesn't necessarily have an industry definition. I think we can all agree it's life building. And so regenerative is a spectrum and it's a constant continuum of improvement. So on the far right is life building above ground and below ground, building up the soil, the soil microbes, and everything that is living and interconnected below the ground, which directly relates back into more thriving ecosystems that cumulatively build on itself over time. And this is how we can also differentiate between sustainable, where sustainable, as much as I appreciate and value sustainability, I think many of us can probably agree that we need to make sure that we are regenerative or regenerating. And we've seen within our food system, degenerative practices, monoculture, monocrops came up, tilling, and those are great examples of, in Iowa, where we just heard the majority of the crop is soy or corn, yet the people that are farming that land are living in a food desert because they don't have the food, they don't have the thriving life systems around them to be able to grow that food. So completely agree again with Hannah on those are the systems that we need to focus on shifting so that we as a whole, if we just focus on the United States, for example, we as a whole can then adjust that system and feed ourselves. And then that works on feeding the world in part. This is an example of our home farm. Did you take this picture?
I can't remember if I took this picture or not, but yes. So on the left side there, you see land that is barren and has been tilled for years. So the Thousand Hills Home Farm in Clearwater, like Melissa mentioned, it's where our grandparents grew up. It's where our father grew up. He moved back and now he calls it his community project, where he works with 17 different landowners around the area and rents their land that was once in CRP tilled fields, and they were actually getting subsidized from the government because their land was so barren they were not able to produce a crop, which means they were getting crop insurance. So they were looking for anything that they could do. Matt Meyer stepped in and is now renting this land. And when we took over these degraded lands, a lot of them were at less than 1% soil organic matter. Over the course of 5 to 10 years, we are now at about a 7% soil organic matter. So on the right is one of the fields that we rotationally graze with our cattle. So yeah, you can see it's green and flourishing compared to the degraded tilled soil on the left.
And I think that Macy brought up another good point, that one of the pieces of land, as we kind of patchwork this together through different paddocks on our home farm, CRP land has been, it measures out to be lowest in soil organic matter because it has been left alone with no animal impact. So it's interesting from a testing perspective. So we do a lot of testing. We annually, at a minimum, annually test every single farm that we work with on their overall life. There's a variety. There's I think 15 different indicators that we're testing, from soil to carbon to forage and all of the different pieces that come along with each of those. So in addition to cattle, we also we love life, and we know and how important and valuable that multiple species are. So we are known as a grass-fed beef company, but we do focus on pollinators, for example. So we have bee boxes at our farm that here's a great example of resilience of regenerative agriculture. In 2021, we had a drought in Minnesota, and it was significant. It was tough. We saw a lot of fields, especially monocrop fields, that didn't make it. And we had honeybees on our farm that year. And so we thought we weren't going to get a lot of honey. Well, it turns out that there was a different species of pollination plant that flourished that year. And it did really well because in our soil, it's like a sponge. Once you have healthy soil, it becomes a sponge and it absorbs water better. Well, our pollinator, our bees, loved this pollen source that they were getting and produced over twice as much honey on our farm versus we have somebody who helps us as a beekeeper versus any other boxes that he managed. So it's just another story of resilience and working with our life systems that we have and allowing them to thrive in any situation and environment. And so as we were talking about measuring soil health, this is where we really do dig in, and we take soil from every single one of our farms in multiple locations. And what we know about our current situation in the United States is 220 million tons of our topsoil are blown away, are probably a farmer's most valuable asset, that healthy topsoil. And so what we're doing is making sure that we are measuring the health of our soil. And if it is not improving, we change something about what we're doing to make sure that it does improve, so that we are on a consistent improvement cycle. And we have data that shows that we are, I think Macy was just mentioning that CRP land went from
less than 1%
to 7% organic matter.
And we do we've been working with a company who tracks data, specifically data through our third-party audits, who come out, test our soils, test all of these different indicators on our land. They've taken our product and tested those as well. And actually on one of our pounds of ground beef, it was the first product they started with. And they actually have proven out that is a net carbon sink product. So we're extremely excited about that. And hopefully someday soon we'll be able to put that on package. But if you can see on the bottom where it's the three, with the arrows there, that is one of the practices that we use. So we call it the rule of thirds. We graze a third, trample a third, and leave a third, which ultimately helps speed up photosynthesis. By trampling, they are stirring up the seeds in the forage bed, and by leaving their manure, they are able to fertilize the land. And then by leaving a third, like I said, it just jumpstarts that photosynthesis process. And our cattle do not go back to the same paddock of land for about 50 days on the home farm in Clearwater, giving it really time to regrow and regenerate.
And we have seen, just from that process alone, we've seen native plants come up from their seed bed that haven't been there in decades, and we haven't seeded for it, but it was sitting in the seed bank within the soil, and it was stimulated in the right environment to allow growth. And so some of the native grasses that we haven't seen for a long time are now coming back. When we talked about water or in the soil being like a sponge, this is how we can quantify it. So 1% increase of organic matter in our soil. So in that CRP example, we went from 0 to 7%, let's say. For each increase in each percent increase in organic matter, that equates to 20,000 more gallons of water that acre of land can absorb per rain event, which ultimately that comes back to resilience again, right? Because that's how it's just soaking in the water like a sponge. And when we come into a drought situation, that water is in the soil. It's not blown away or run away like it may be where there is degraded soil.
So these are two images that really reflect that. So when you are at a low percentage in soil organic matter and you're not able to hold you don't have a high water holding capacity, you get what these two images are. So that bottom one there is a local farm, row crop tilled monoculture, where it is completely flooded, and this happens quite often. I would say more years than not. It looks like this towards the end of the summer. And the one on the side there is a picture of a pasture that also does row cropping and spraying, and you can see that the runoff, rather than it soaking into the ground, into the soils, it is actually running off into the waterways.
Going back to our pollinator friends, at least and why we find this so important, at least 5 species of butterflies have gone extinct in the United States, and 40 or more butterflies or moths are listed under ESA. And biodiversity is being lost at 1,000 times the normal rate than they should be or than expected for pollinators, insects, and native grasses. And I think we can relate a lot of this back to neonicotinoids and how either sprayed or seed coated, those are killing off our pollinators, and that the spray or seed coating again goes back to our food system of really focusing on GMOs or spraying, or if those seeds are coated, then they have, that's kind of like spraying in advance even before the plant pops out of the ground. And so as soon as any sort of pollinator starts consuming something like that, they die, and they are dying in a very rapid rate.
So this is just a really quick fun fact. We again took some data, some purchase history, some purchase data, and came up with this fun fact to be able to relate it to consumers, because as I'm sure everyone on this call is pretty aware of the food system and what goes into our food system and how animals are raised, and so forth. But coming from someone who does marketing and communications, the average population of consumers does not know what regenerative agriculture is, does not know the difference between regenerative or organic. So this is just kind of something that we like to share, to just kind of relate to the everyday consumer, that with every 1 pound of ground beef, you are helping regenerate approximately 300 square feet of soil, which is equivalent to the area of 1 school bus.
We've kind of hit this pretty well. Benefits of regenerative agriculture are aplenty. The other things that we find extremely important in the raising of cattle for specific reasons, for the health of the cattle and the health of people, there's no grain or no grain byproducts, no artificial hormones, no antibiotics. We know that antibiotic situation is contributing to a major issue. Even, for example, I read an article, I don't know if anybody follows the food tank here, but the food tank released an article yesterday that said that CAFOs, or concentrated animal feedlot operations, that where there's a lot of cattle in a situation or in a small area at one time, that is directly contributing to UTIs and the overall situation of antibiotics, and antibiotics are not able to help that anymore. And that's just one example of antibiotic resistance that we are developing as a society. No feedlots, no gluten, and no GMOs. And I think we've talked about all the reasons as to why, and I think you probably can understand why. But we don't like to be the one to say that this is all great and good. That's why we make sure that we have third-party validations, and we find that extremely important. These are two that we're working with right now on the Savory and Land to Market are related, and then American Grass-Fed Association. They're highly credible, and I suggest that you would look each of these up to learn a little bit more about what they're doing overall for our food system and others who may be certified within this space.
Yeah, so like Melissa mentioned, Savory and Land to Market are kind of like parent sister organizations. We have been working with them for about 5 or 6 years now. They work on a global level, but Land to Market is the one that is going out and monitoring each of these farms that we work with. So they do a short and long-term monitoring. So the short term is once every year. We have third-party audits go out and test our farmers' soils and our, the landscape, the watershed, 15 indicators that they test across multiple different plots of land on each farm. So that's the short-term monitoring. And then they also do a more intense, extensive monitoring every 5 years as well. So we're in year 5 or 6 of doing the Land to Market verification, and it is actually on each one of our products. We have about 150 products out in the market, ranging from fully cooked items like sausages and hot dogs all the way to, ribeye steaks. And so the Land to Market seal is actually on each one of our products, which we're super excited about. As you can see there, we were the first, well, actually, it doesn't say, we were the first brand to have each and every one of our products verified by Savory Land to Market. So we're extremely proud of that.
And what that really means is that when we're collecting the data, we're finding that it's great, it's good, and it's improving. So we mentioned those 3 different kind of categories across 15 different indicators, and that's what they're measuring.
Yeah.
And they're telling us that every single one of the producers is improving, which is how we can get that seal on the package. AGA is very similar. They're very focused on grass-fed, and they're very detailed as well about soil health, but then they're also layering in the animal welfare component, which we find to be very important. So being certified as AGA is another rigorous way to say, hey, these animals are treated well, and so is the land that they are being grazed on. So we are solely focused on domestic product, and that's important to us because we know that the food system around us is it needs help within the United States specifically. And we talked about kind of Iowa and how many people can live in food deserts there, and we want the communities, especially rural communities around us, to be thriving. And so within our supply web that we work with, we're very specific about the type of producers, but also then processors that we're working with, and that we are able to work with small to mid-sized processors that we can go visit and we can go on site and we can see their practices. We can work with them. We know they're nimble, and also the people that are living within that community are directly supported. Our processing system in the United States is a challenge that was accelerated, or the spotlight was shown on that during the pandemic. But it's mostly driven by a handful of major brands and food suppliers in the country. You probably know who they are, but that it poses a challenge in a few ways in trying to navigate the whole system, but also there's not the transparency piece isn't there. And so we value being able to work with smaller, mid-sized processors, and then getting to the retailers. When we focus on who we work with as retailers, we really like to align with like-minded businesses, and that's a lot of natural fruits and co-ops. That's a lot of so that was the majority of where the product went for a long time. There are others now who are a little bit larger, but they're also very mission-minded and have keep the mission-minded consumer in mind. And so those are the organizations that we make sure that we can partner with to help all of our systems thrive together. And so back to the United States thing, cattle's kind of, or our food system in general is kind of interesting in that there is a country of origin label that can be put on a product, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that product is coming from the United States. It may have been put in a package in the United States, but that doesn't mean that if we're talking protein, that animal may not have been ever lived in the United States. And so if it's something that's interesting for you, I would encourage this as an advocacy opportunity of any food type that you may want to become engaged at that advocacy level, supporting the country of origin label within the United States, so that there is that transparency, because I think it's a little bit misleading in its current situation. You can think what you'd like, but that's, I think, something that we can all do collectively. So that's who we are. These are a few of the family members who are behind Thousand Hills. And we appreciate you hearing us and having a great conversation, and most importantly, having a passion for our food system.
Well, thank you, Melissa. And we really do appreciate your presentation. It's been very, very vivid, very graphic, very detailed, but I, especially as one who teaches environmental science, appreciate a lot of the scientific detail that you've presented in everything from carbon sequestration in soil to different cycles, biogeological cycles. I think, for a lot of us, I know for a fact that after today, my agriculture food lecture is going to undergo a modification a lot. I've really learned a lot, and I think that we probably have Q&A in the chat as we're encouraging people to put their questions there. There has been a lively discussion going on during the presentation, with a lot of it revolving around the issue of the ethical treatment of animals, the environmental impact of the agro food industry, but you've focused a lot on what are the costs of the industrial model when applied to the meat protein. So I think you're presenting as something that's far more nuanced and makes important distinctions between the sector, the meat sector as we know it, complete with its slaughterhouses and packing plants and hormones and all the rest of it, and what is a sustainable system at the farm level. I think probably come from a farm family, and it's not often that we get to have people who are actually live in rural America and deal with producing food. It's an eye-opener for us. I rely a lot on my scholarly articles, things like that. So I'm going to let Beth, Beth and Zhao are watching the chat, and Denise Robb is a professor at Pierce College. She's a very active vegan. So a lot of her questions are going to essentially question maybe the premise. I don't know, but we'll let Beth or Zhao speak to the questions in the chat, and I will just
We have had a very lively discussion. And I think a couple, mostly we just have questions popping up. So most of it has been discussion about whether meat is an appropriate food. And I think that would be an interesting question for you to address. I don't know if you're willing to. I know what you all do is produce meat. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but if that's something that you feel like you would be willing to talk about.
Well, I think it's a completely fair question. And I think it's great to have a lively conversation, which it means there's a lot of passion, which passion is a catalyst for change. And so I appreciate that. And protein, I come from a public health nutrition background, and I wholeheartedly believe everything in moderation. And I wholeheartedly believe that we need to ask questions about where our food comes from. Whether or not you choose protein for your personal diet, I think is a personal choice. I'm not going to try to convince one person or another as to whether or not they should be consuming protein, animal protein, that is. My personal choice is regenerative or grass-fed. proteins, and whether it's Thousand Hills or not. And what I think is very interesting is the human health studies. And I encourage you to look up Dr. Stefan Van Vliet's work. He is a researcher out of Utah State. He is the one we happen to be working with, but he's not just working with us. He's working through a variety of different protein sources, including non-animal proteins. And so you know where my lens and my perspective is coming from a place of, I support grass-fed proteins. I appreciate that for my health, but I also appreciate, that there is some research there. And so I would refer you to, I'll put it in the chat here, Dr. Stefan Van Vliet. And I will also refer you to the Bionutrient Food Association. They are doing a beef study, a global beef study that's measuring the practices of food, of the way that beef is raised, and linking it back to the nutrient density of that product. And then you can look at the micro and macronutrients associated with it, and the polyphenols, and the things that you may find interesting when looking at a product. And so that, to me, I appreciate the transparency, and I think our system needs more transparency. And I think that's what it comes down to, whether there's personal opinions on, and I respect the opinions that we have of what we are actually personally consuming. But those are resources that I would refer folks to when it comes to making choices about the types. So I'll pop them in here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And then I think the next question that's come up is about factory farms. And if all factory farms, if this may address, how much cattle were grazing, and what the amount of land that currently graze now?
Okay, so I think we got part of the question. Is the question, I just want to repeat it so I know I understand this correctly. Is it about how many animals are on a concentrated animal feedlot to classify it that, or is it kind of about the concentration of animals?
I think
Beth is cutting out. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the question is just if all factory farms went to because I agree, if you're going to eat animals, grass-fed is far better than non-grass fed. But if all factory farms went in this direction,
Mm-hmm.
how many cows would be grazing, and what about the amount of land that would be used? I'm not sure how many cows there are now. I imagine it's in the millions.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so what would that look like? I'm trying to imagine an all grass fed with the amount of meat that people seem to want to eat.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's a question. That's a great question. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head on if we were to convert all of our protein to grazed protein, what would that look like, and is it feasible? I think is kind of what we're getting at here. And I don't know. I know that and it's something certainly we can all.
Oh, it's over $1 billion. I just looked it up. There's over $1 billion over 1 billion cows.
Well, I think the other piece of this is 30% of the food in the United States that's produced is wasted. So I think we have to look at the whole system too, of if 30% is wasted, and then, I'm not even going to pretend that I'll be able to do this quick math on how to, on if the land is available for grazing and what that means for numbers, but it's certainly something I'll look more into. But I think we just need to look at the system as a whole, and everything needs to think about, are we looking at it through the lens of a healthy, thriving, regenerative system that can build on itself? Statistically, I love the question, but I don't know the answer to that.
Let me move you on to a sort of slightly different discussion, which would be about that regenerative quality. So we only have a couple of minutes, so maybe you could talk about a little bit more about how this impacts the watershed and the importance, say, in relationship to other farming practices, how you did mention watershed And
Mhm.
also you mentioned the ability of soils to capture carbon. So I don't know if you'd be willing to kind of talk about those a little bit more.
Sure. It looks like we're in the flash round of answering. So
Yeah.
there was an example that we showed in our slide deck that had a stream that was brown and cloudy because it had topsoil running off. We started grazing a piece of land that had one of those creeks on it that was brown and cloudy with sediment from topsoil runoff and chemicals. We started grazing just around the land around it, and it cleared right up. That happened to be a tributary to the Mississippi as well, and it is consistently clear once it cleared up. And it took only, I think, one season it was very clear, 2 seasons it was completely clear and cleaned up.
And the farmer that we rent that specific land from, that Melissa just told that story, actually came up to us and said that he has never, since he owned the land, he has never seen the creek as clean as it was. He had never been able to see all the way down to the bottom. So that's just one example of the watershed.
Mm-hmm. And carbon sequestration, that's measured directly back into the soil organic matter and the soil organic matter that we're measuring. And so we have information on carbon sequestration that it is being absorbed back into the soils, not through the photosynthesis of the healthy, diverse grazelands that we are working with. Diversity is another key important part of all of this, the grasslands, for the health of the cattle, for the health of the soil, and carbon sequestration.
All right, I think we are out of time. In fact, we're a little bit over time. And thank you both. And I don't know, George, you wanna close this out for us?
Well, just to say that this was recorded and that on our website for April 28th, which is a whole page on our website, we will feature any contributions we've had from our speakers today, as well as the recording when we get that from Zoom, so that you'll be able to share the content today. We've seen some PowerPoint presentations, we've seen some references to web pages, and we'll have all that hopefully well fleshed out on that page at the website that is behind us, SEILACCD.net. Thank you, Melissa and Marcy, and all the presenters today. Thank you, Lord Brent, for helping us with the Professional Development College and all faculty who have attended. And we will see you again in May when we'll have hopefully a revisiting of some of these very important issues involving food, agriculture, and climate and sustainability, which is a topic very near and dear to actually a few of us in the SEI who formally studied this subject matter before we were teaching other things. So thanks again. And with that, I think I'll if I can do the stop the recording, I'll
Wait,
do
and
that.
just one last thing, I'm just gonna encourage you, please fill out our survey. You see our survey in the chat before you leave, just click on that link and we'd appreciate it. You can put all kinds of comments in there.
Yeah. Thank you, Beth, for reminding me about that. All righty then. I'll stop recording and